I've always said the woods speak in their own language, and most people just don't know how to listen. Maybe that's why so many campers convince themselves the silence means safety, or that a quiet night around the RV is proof the world has nothing lurking for them in the dark. But silence, I've learned, is often the loudest warning you'll ever get. My name's Aaron Whitfield. I'm 44 years old, born and raised in Wyoming, though these days I spend most of my time on the road, towing my fifth wheel across the western states. This story I'm about to tell you, it changed the way I camp forever. It happened 2 summers ago in a little campground tucked against the cedar-lined ridges of northern Utah. I'd been chasing solitude that season. Work had burned me out, city noise had numbed my nerves, and I wanted nothing more than to hear the rustle of trees instead of engines, to see stars instead of neon signs. A buddy of mine, a local from Ogden named Rick, told me about a campground near Causey Reservoir. Secluded, he said. Real quiet. Nobody goes there after dark. He laughed when he said it, but I caught the edge in his voice. The kind of edge that makes you wonder if he's joking or if he's just telling you the truth in a way you can ignore. I should have asked more questions, but solitude was all I wanted. So I hitched up, filled the tanks, and drove north into the hills. The drive itself was uneventful, winding through canyons that slowly narrowed until the light itself seemed filtered by the tall stands of cedar. Those trees, they weren't like the pines I was used to. They stood in tight clusters, with bark that split into dark furrows, giving the illusion of faces turned inward, whispering. Their needles carried a sharp, medicinal smell, clean but suffocating when the wind pressed it close. I remember rolling down the window as I climbed toward the campground, breathing it in, thinking, this place feels ancient. The campground was almost empty when I arrived. Just 2 other rigs parked far off on the opposite loop, their owners already tucked inside. I chose a spot backed against the tree line. It was late afternoon, the shadows already stretching long across the gravel pads, the air cooler than it had any right to be in July. I set up quick, stabilizers down, slides out, awning deployed. My dog, Baxter, a shepherd mix with too much curiosity for his own good, bounded out and immediately started sniffing the tree line. His hackles rose. Coyotes, maybe, I muttered. That was what I told myself. I clipped him to the lead and tried to ignore the way he kept staring at one particular patch of trees, ears stiff, body tense. As night settled, the campground fell unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no owls, not even the distant trickle of water from the reservoir, just the occasional shuffle of needles high above when the wind shifted. I grilled a small dinner, gave Baxter his food, and we sat together under the awning as darkness took hold. The sky was clear, the stars sharp, but the cedars blocked most of the horizon. Their silhouettes rose like black walls, hemming me in. That was when I heard it, a single deliberate knock. It echoed from the tree line behind my RV, deep and hollow like someone had rapped wood against wood. Baxter's head shot up, a low growl building in his chest. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Woodpecker, I whispered to myself, though I knew damn well woodpeckers didn't sound like that. This wasn't a rapid staccato tapping. This was one solid strike. Purposeful. Measured. I forced myself to breathe, to finish dinner, to pack things away. I told myself I'd been around the woods long enough not to spook at every noise. But when I finally went inside and locked the door, I kept the shades cracked, eyes drifting to that dark wall of cedars again and again. The knock didn't come again that night. But just before I fell asleep, I swear I felt it, that sensation of being watched, the kind that crawls across your shoulders, tightening the skin at the back of your neck. I told myself I was imagining it, that exhaustion was playing tricks. The next morning, I found footprints, not animal tracks, human, bare. They circled the RV in the dirt, faint but undeniable. The heel, the arch, the splay of toes. My stomach turned cold. Baxter whined, nose pressed to the ground where the prints cut closest to the door. I crouched there a long time, studying them. They weren't big, maybe the size of a teenager's foot, but they were wrong. The stride was uneven, dragging in places, pressed deep in others, as though whoever, or whatever, made them didn't walk like the rest of us. That day, I tried to shake it off. Hiked the nearby trail, let Baxter run by the reservoir, pretended the morning discovery didn't gnaw at me. But every time I returned to camp, my eyes went straight to that tree line. And every time, I caught myself holding my breath as if waiting for something to step out. By dusk, I'd had enough. I lit a fire, louder and brighter than I normally would. Something about flames always makes us feel in control, like light can keep out what we don't understand. I sat there late into the night, listening. That silence had returned, so heavy it pressed against my ears. Baxter didn't settle. He kept pacing the perimeter, growling low, sometimes staring into the trees with a tension that pulled at my gut. Then it came again. Knock. This time, closer. Not behind the RV, but to the left, maybe 20 yards deep among the cedars. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to douse the fire and retreat inside. But I stayed put, eyes locked on the shadows. Another knock. And then something else. A breath. Not mine, not Baxter's. A slow exhale carried faintly through the branches. I stood up, my chair scraping the gravel. Baxter barked, lunging against his leash, teeth bared toward the sound. The fire popped, a shower of sparks leaping upward. In that flash of light, I thought I saw it, just for a moment. Two pale reflections among the branches. Eyes, wide, unblinking, fixed on me. When the sparks died, the eyes were gone. I stayed outside until the fire burned low, heart hammering, telling myself I'd imagined it. But when I finally crawled into bed, every creak of the RV, every brush of wind against the awning made me flinch. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of faces in the bark, of eyes peering through needle-thin gaps. Morning came, but the relief I expected never did, because when I stepped outside, there were new footprints in the dirt, fresh, closer, and this time they stopped just inches from my door. I stood there staring at those prints as the early sun lit the gravel in pale gold. They were sharp, crisp, untouched by wind or dew, as though they'd been pressed into the earth only hours before. The edges of each toe were distinct, the dirt still faintly crumbled at the ridges. I crouched down, my stomach twisting. They were small, yes, but not childish, not playful. They looked heavy, each step deliberate, as though something had leaned its full weight into the earth. Baxter wouldn't go near them. He circled, ears pinned, growling low, tail tucked. I knew that sound, different from his bark at a squirrel or his chase of a rabbit. This was fear. I wanted to rationalize it. Maybe some kid from another campsite had wandered through in the night. But I knew the campground was empty except for 2 rigs on the far side, families I hadn't seen outside since I arrived. And what child wanders barefoot through the woods at 3 a.m, circles a stranger's RV, then vanishes back into the trees without a word? The footprints told me more than I wanted to know. Whoever left them hadn't just walked by. They'd stopped. They'd looked at my door. Right at my door, the day dragged, heavy with dread. I tried to hike again, but the forest felt different now. Each cedar trunk seemed to narrow the path, the air colder the deeper I went. I caught myself checking over my shoulder more than once, half convinced something was pacing me just out of sight. Baxter stuck close, his usual curiosity dampened into silence, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. By the time I returned to camp, my nerves were frayed. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, pack up and head south. But as night fell, a part of me knew leaving wouldn't matter. Whatever had come to my sight last night, it knew I was here now. And the thought that it might follow gnawed at me worse than staying. So I made a choice I regret. I decided to confront it. I stoked the fire higher than before, flames crackling, casting wild shadows on the cedars. I set a lantern under the awning, another near the hitch. I even sat with a flashlight across my lap like a weapon. Baxter lay at my feet, restless, his eyes never leaving the dark line of trees. The silence deepened again. No wind, no insects, just the low roar of the fire and the uneven rhythm of my own breathing. Then, right on cue, knock. This time, closer still. 15 yards, maybe less. My pulse spiked. I lifted the flashlight, its beam trembling against the black trunks. Nothing but bark and needles. Another knock. Steadier. Louder. Baxter snapped to his feet, snarling. The leash went taut, his body straining toward the sound. I tried to steady the light, my hands slick with sweat. Then silence. No footsteps, no breaking branches, just silence. I should have stayed put. Should have kept the fire high and waited out the night. But something in me snapped, a mixture of fear and anger, maybe shame at feeling hunted on my own campsite. I grabbed the flashlight, unclipped Baxter, and stepped toward the trees. The beam cut through the first row of trunks, then the second, washing across the cedar bark. My breath came fast, ears ringing with every step. Baxter surged ahead, barking wildly, then stopped dead, hackles raised. His growl turned low, guttural, primal. That's when I saw them again. Eyes. 2 pale circles reflected back at me from between the trunks. Wide, motionless, watching. My body froze. Everything in me screamed to run, to get back to the RV, to slam the door and never look back, but I couldn't move. The eyes didn't blink, didn't shift, they just stayed. And then in the silence came a sound that cut straight into my bones. A laugh. Soft, broken, like a child imitating an adult. It rose from the shadows with a rhythm that didn't belong in any human throat. I stumbled backward, dragging Baxter, who barked like he'd tear the forest apart if I let him. The eyes blinked once, and in that blink they were gone. I didn't remember running back to the RV, but suddenly I was inside. Door locked, blinds shut, heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. Baxter paced the narrow floor, barking at the walls, tail rigid. For hours I sat there, every light on, flashlight in hand, waiting for something to knock on the door. Nothing came. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Not with the echo of that laugh still in my ears. Morning arrived, and for the first time, I felt no relief at daylight. Because when I stepped outside, the footprints were back. Not circling this time. Just one set leading straight out of the trees, ending at the steps of my RV. I knelt down, studying them, and my chest tightened. The prints were heavier now, pressed deeper into the soil. And the last one, the one closest to the door, was smeared as if whoever made it had lingered there a long time. Watching. That was when I realized something that turned my blood cold. The cedar trunks nearest the RV, they weren't just trees. Not anymore. On the bark, faint but clear, were markings. Scratches, lines, almost like carvings. Circles, rough shapes of eyes. Dozens of them, as if something had been drawing me, as if the trees themselves had been watching. I staggered back from those carved eyes as though the bark itself had lunged at me. My legs felt hollow, unsteady, and Baxter barked as if he, too, understood what I was seeing. The cedar trunks bore dozens of them, eyes gouged into the bark, not cleanly, not with tools, but jagged, crude, torn into the flesh of the trees. Some were small and round, others long and narrow, but all of them stared in the same direction, toward my campsite. I reached out, hand trembling, and brushed my fingers across one of the carvings. The grooves were fresh. Sap oozed from the cut, sticky and bright against my skin. Whoever or whatever had made them had done it recently. Maybe while I was inside, too afraid to open the door. The thought nearly drove me to my knees. I stumbled back to the RV, Baxter tugging at the leash as if urging me to leave, now before the trees themselves closed in. I wanted to. God, I wanted to hitch up and barrel down the canyon road without looking back. But my body felt locked between fight and flight, unable to choose. I sat on the steps of the RV with my head in my hands, breathing hard, the acrid cedar scent filling my lungs until it felt like I was suffocating. All morning, I paced. The prints, the carvings, the silence. Every part of me screamed I wasn't alone here. But the stubborn part of me, the part that had always refused to back down from the unknown, kept me tethered to the site. Maybe I thought if I left now, whatever was watching would follow, that if I didn't face it, it would own me for the rest of my life. By afternoon, the sky had clouded over, turning the canyon dim, the cedars darker, shadows pooling like ink. I took Baxter for a short walk, but even he was subdued, tail low, ears pinned. He kept glancing over his shoulder as though something trailed us just out of sight. We didn't go far. I turned back quickly, every instinct raw, aware of every snapping twig and shifting branch. When the RV came into view again, relief hit me, but it didn't last, because there was something on the door. At first I thought it was dirt or sap smeared by the wind, but as I got closer, my chest constricted. It wasn't dirt. It was a handprint. A bare hand pressed into the door, outlined in some dark, sticky substance. The fingers were long, too long, stretching up past the handle as if reaching. I touched it without thinking, then jerked back. It was wet, and it smelled like iron. I wiped my hand against my jeans, panic rising, trying not to believe what every sense was screaming. Blood. My mind scrambled for answers. Some sick prank? One of the families across the campground trying to scare me off? But no, nobody had been near. And the prints, the eyes in the trees, the laugh. No ordinary person would go that far, that deep into madness. That night, I didn't build a fire. I didn't sit outside. I locked the RV, drew every shade, and sat with Baxter curled at my feet, a kitchen knife on the counter, my flashlight within reach. The silence pressed harder than ever. I could hear my own heartbeat, the tick of the wall clock, the faint hiss of the propane fridge. Every creak of the RV's frame made me flinch. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. I almost convinced myself nothing would happen, and then it began. A slow, deliberate scratching. Not at the door, not at the windows. On the roof. Long, dragging scrapes like fingernails pulling across the metal. Baxter went berserk. Barking, claws scrabbling at the linoleum as he tried to leap upward. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it at the ceiling as though light could pierce metal. The scratching grew louder, circling the roof. Then it stopped. Silence fell heavy again. My breath rasped loud in my throat. Baxter whined, ears swiveling, nose tilted upward. A knock followed, not at the door this time, but on the roof hatch above my bed. 3 slow, hollow knocks. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every nerve screamed at me to run, to get in the truck, to drive until the tires shredded. But my legs wouldn't move. I sat frozen, the flashlight beam quivering in my grip. Then came the worst sound of all. A whisper. So faint I thought at first it was the wind. But no, it carried rhythm, breath, intention. A voice. Aaron! My name. Drawn out like a song, stretched thin, broken. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. Baxter barked so fiercely I thought he'd hurt himself. I scrambled to grab the knife, knuckles white around the handle. The whisper came again, this time closer to the wall, as if it moved along the roof toward me. Aaron! I snapped. I flung the door open, stormed out with the flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other. The night air slapped me cold, but I didn't care. My beam cut through the dark, across the cedars, over the roofline. Nothing. No movement. No figure. No eyes. Just silence. But when I turned back toward the RV, the beam landed on the side panel near the steps. My stomach lurched. Another handprint. Fresh. Smudged downward as though someone had dragged their palm across the siding while I'd been inside. And next to it, etched deep into the aluminum, were 4 words. I see you, Aaron. The words hit me like a physical blow. I could feel the letters under my fingertips, the aluminum still warm from the day's sun, but the message was carved in a way that seemed older than metal, like a promise hammered into me by something patient. I see you, Aaron. The whisper earlier, the laugh, the prints, the eyes in the bark, suddenly everything pointed at a thought I refused to have. This wasn't random. It was personal. My hands shook so badly I had to sit down on the steps to keep from falling. Baxter circled me, low whines snagging on his throat as if he, too, understood the tone the trees had taken. Out there, the cedars hummed in the night wind, needles brushing like fingers, and in every rustle I heard the same syllable. Watch, watch, watch. I wanted to pull up stakes, to drive until the world blurred into interstate lines and diner coffee. But the thought of the words, solid and deliberate on my RV, tethered me. If it could find my name carved into aluminum, could it find me on a road? Was there anywhere that counted as safe? I dragged my eyes away from the message and scanned the campground. 2 rigs on the far loop slept under their own small moons of light. No one came out. No flash of a phone, no headlights approaching. The whole place held its breath with me. I felt suddenly foolish, like a man who'd shouted into a canyon and now waited for the echo to answer. But there was no echo here, only an answering stillness that was worse. Inside, I wiped my palms on my jeans and forced myself to think. There had to be an explanation. Some kids, some drunks, a prank that had grown teeth. The sensible part of my brain, the one that paid the bills and checked oil levels, kept listing possibilities like lifelines. Someone had used a knife on the bark. Someone had smeared sap and something else on my door. Someone had climbed on my roof. Someone had scratched words into aluminum. Even the laugh, maybe a neighbor playing with an app or a wind pattern that mimicked a human voice. And then the whisper had said my name. Okay, I said aloud, like logic could brace me. Okay, Aaron, breathe. I told myself I'd sleep in the truck. That felt safer. Simple metal, open sky. But I couldn't shake the idea that whatever had been out here wanted something from me, and leaving might be exactly what it wanted. So I did the only other thing I could think to do. I reached for the thing that had always steadied me, memory. I thought of my father, who taught me how to listen to the weather in his ranch kitchen, who once told me, "When the land leans in, son, don't lean back. Lean in and learn." He'd died 10 years prior, sudden and stupid, leaving a hole I'd filled with miles and rigs. I'd never said all the things I wanted to say. Maybe that was why the trees were whispering my name, some mirror of my own unfinished words. Maybe. That feeling of memory didn't comfort me for long. The cedar shadows seemed to tighten, the carvings on the trunks like a chorus turning toward me. I went inside, turned on every light I had, and sat like a man on watch, listening to an enemy I couldn't see. Baxter finally settled, but only because he'd worn himself out pacing. I stared at the ceiling, at the small metal hatch that had been knocked earlier, at the walls that now kept secrets in their insulation. By dawn, the adrenaline bled out of me into a brittle exhaustion. I moved mechanically, packing a bag with essentials, checking straps, eyeing the hitch as if it might jump up and lash at me. The sky was smeared with gray. Low clouds hugged the ridgeline like a hand. I told myself I'd leave, drive to the nearest town, find someone who'd laugh and say, "Oh, that old causey place, local kids, that's all." I'd laugh too, and then I'd forget. Except when I turned the ignition, when I slid into the truck and shoved the key into the ignition, my hands went numb. There, in the rearview mirror between the rippling reflection of my own face and the dashboard, a dark shape stood at the edge of the tree line. Not a person exactly, more like an absence, the forest pulled tight around it, tall and still. For a second, the whole world slowed. I could hear the truck's engine like a heartbeat. I could hear my own breath, short and hard. Then the figure raised a hand and put it to its face, a slow, deliberate motion as if peering through invisible binoculars, and then nothing. No footsteps, no movement of branches, just a silhouette that didn't belong in the geometry of trees. The rational mind leapt forward. Shadow, a trick of light, a deer upright by some odd angle. The rest of me, animal, old and honest, said, don't move. And in the space between those voices, I found myself opening the door and walking toward the trees. Baxter tugged behind me, but when the leash tightened, his pace slowed. The air smelled of cedar and something sweeter beneath it, iron and something like old paper. My skin prickled as we approached the line where trunks merged into a thicker darkness. Each step sounded too loud, as if I'd put my foot into a drum. The carved eyes watched. The handprints shadowed the aluminum. The words on the RV hummed with a memory that had anchored here long before me. I should have turned back at the first sign of a beat on bone, but I pressed on, because curiosity is a stubborn vertebra. In the underbrush, something small shifted, a rabbit perhaps, sending up a spray of dry needles. The sound was ordinary, and yet when it broke the thick air, I jumped as if slapped. A path opened between two old cedars. It hadn't been there when I'd come in the day before. This path was narrow and trodden, pressed into the loam like a toe in dough. It sloped down, curling around a rock outcropping that shielded a shallow hollow. A smell wafted up from it, damp and ancient, like the inside of a book. Without knowing why, I stepped down. The hollow wasn't big, maybe 10 feet across, and in the center of it stood a stump that had been carved away. Around the stump, pine needles lay in concentric rings, and embedded in the sapped, sticky soil were more prints. Human. Child-sized, but not quite. Their toes were too long, the heels too narrow. Whoever had left them had stood on the edge of the world and looked in. On the stump, someone, or something, had arranged small things. A pile of stones, a broken lens from a flashlight, a child's small plastic horse, faded and half-buried, and folded atop the stones like some sacrament, a scrap of paper. I reached for it with the exaggerated care of a man who knows he might be touching evidence or a wound. The paper was old and stiff. Letters had been scrawled across it in a hand that wavered, small, cramped, like someone writing with a stick on a rough surface. "You're seen," it read. "We watch and remember." Beneath, in a different stroke, someone had added, "Don't leave. Not yet." Baxter whined and nosed at the edge of the hollow, urging retreat, and for a moment I felt something in the wood behind us breathe. I realized the air was thicker here, like a memory condensed. The trees leaned in closer, their branches knitting together overhead, and in that knitting I saw, imagined, faces. Not faces so much as the suggestion of them, hollows for eyes, lines like mouths, watching, waiting. I turned to go, and the path behind me had changed. It wasn't the same opening I'd come through. Instead, the trunks knit into a wall like impenetrable and ancient. Panic rose, hot and feral. I grabbed the leash and tugged, and Baxter danced ahead, but then skidded to a stop as if the ground itself had become sticky. The angle I'd taken to enter was gone, replaced by trunks that grew too close, roots that reached like arthritic fingers. That's when the whisper found me again. Not from the roof this time, not from the RV, but right at my ear, so close I felt breath on my cheek. One silent word, drawn out like a thread. "Aaron." I spun, knife drawn, but there was no one. The hollow, the stump, the little offerings, and the thick smell of sap and iron. My knees shook, and my throat made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cry. I wanted to call out, to tell whatever was listening that I'd come in peace, that I'd leave, that the mistake could be corrected. But the words thinned and fled the instant I tried to shape them. Then, from above, high in the canopy where the light bled thin, something shifted. A dim, reflective flash, an eye perhaps catching stray sun. Or another trick. My rational mind, exhausted and threadbare, reached for every mundane explanation it could. What I couldn't explain was the way the hollow seemed to breathe an answer, the way the rings of pine needles tightened as if to keep a secret. And what I couldn't stomach was the certainty that once you were known here, the knowing didn't let you go easily. I forced myself to step back, to find the route I'd come, to unmake the path the forest had made me discover. Each footfall felt like negotiation. Each breath was a price. And all the while the trees leaned, patient as old judges, waiting to see if I would keep walking out or if I would stay long enough to be claimed. I found the opening finally, but the direction I'd taken out felt longer, twisted by roots, and turned back on itself. When I emerged into the campground, dirt on my boots and the scrap of paper folded in my pocket, the world seemed smaller, closer. The RVs slept under their thin lights. The message on my side panel still stared at me. "I see you, Aaron." I climbed into the driver's seat, hands smeared with sap and doubt, and felt the weight of something settling in me that wasn't quite fear, not exactly, but a deep and stubborn attention. As I started, the engine and the truck's vibration hummed in my bones. A single thought lodged in my head like a splinter. Whatever watched from the cedars didn't want me to leave. And maybe it never had. I idled there with my hands clenched tight on the wheel, staring out at the cedar wall pressing in around the campground. The morning light was thin, a strained gray that did nothing to soften the shadows between the trunks. Every nerve in my body screamed to drive, to break the spell, to put as many miles between me and this place as the truck could handle. But my chest felt tight, like there was a hand inside my ribcage pressing down, urging me to stay. The scrap of paper burned in my pocket. "Don't leave, not yet." Baxter whined beside me, restless. He pawed at the passenger window, staring not at the road but back at the tree line, as if waiting for something to step out. His ears were flat, tail stiff, the kind of posture I'd only ever seen when he was about to bolt. I shifted into drive. My foot hovered over the gas, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Not the kind of movement that comes from wind or a squirrel darting across the dirt. This was tall, deliberate, and unmistakably human. A figure stepping between the cedars just far enough back that the shadows swallowed all but the outline. I froze. The figure stood perfectly still. Arms at its sides, head tilted slightly like it was studying me. And then, slowly, it raised its arm again, hand curling over its face like binoculars, peering through the distance. That same motion I'd seen in the mirror. The truck shuddered under my grip. I pressed harder on the brake. When I looked again, the figure was gone. But in its place, where it had stood a heartbeat before, the cedars bore new carvings. Fresh, glistening with sap, raw against the old bark. More eyes, dozens of them. Watching. I don't remember deciding to kill the engine, but the silence that followed was suffocating. I sat there, pulse thrumming, Baxter's breath loud in the cab. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not with the sense that if I turned my back, the watcher would follow me down the canyon and sit just behind the reflection in my mirrors for the rest of my life. So I stepped out. The ground was soft, damp from the night. Each step crunched pine needles, and every sound seemed too loud in the hush. Baxter refused to leave the truck at first, pulling against the leash until finally he jumped down and stayed plastered to my side. His head swiveled constantly, eyes wide, nose working overtime. I walked back toward the RV, my stomach knotted. The carved words were still etched deep in the aluminum. "I see you, Aaron." I ran my fingers across them, hoping by some miracle they'd fade in daylight. They didn't. The grooves were deep, undeniable. And then I noticed something new. On the ground beneath the door, pressed into the dirt as clear as if they'd been made moments ago, were more footprints. Not circling, not wandering. Just one straight line, leading from the cedar trees directly to my steps. And on top of the bottom step itself, smeared dark and sticky, was another handprint. The fingers were splayed wide. Too wide. I stumbled back, my throat dry. Baxter growled low, fur rising along his spine. The handprint glistened in the weak light, fresh. I scanned the trees, heart pounding. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking in the silence. The words echoed back at me, hollow, unanswered. But then the air shifted. The cedars swayed, though no wind touched the canyon. Their branches creaked like old bones, and the smell of sap thickened until it coated my tongue. And beneath it all, I heard it again. That broken laugh. Childlike, but wrong. Drawn out, uneven, scraping along the edges of sound. Baxter lunged toward the tree line, barking like he'd rip the world in half to protect me. My grip on the leash nearly failed. The laugh swelled, echoing from trunk to trunk, as if the forest itself had learned the sound and was throwing it back at me. I staggered toward the RV, yanking Baxter with me, slamming the door shut. My hands fumbled at the locks, adrenaline blurring my vision. The laugh didn't stop. It grew louder, overlapping itself, dozens of voices now, each one breaking at odd notes. It pressed against the walls, against the glass, against my skull. And then, silence. Sudden, total. The kind of silence that feels like a void. I stood there, panting, knife still clutched in my shaking hand. Baxter paced the narrow floor, whining, ears flattened tight. The message on the paper echoed in my head, "Don't leave. Not yet." I didn't know if it was a warning or a command. And deep down I realized something I'd been avoiding since the first knock on the cedar bark. This wasn't about whether I chose to stay or go. This was about whether the watcher was finished with me. I woke to a noise like somebody whispering the name of sleep itself. For a moment I lay there, palms flat against the covers, listening to the slow clock of the RV, telling myself the world was ordinary and that whatever had happened yesterday had been some strange fluke. Baxter was at my feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The light through the blinds was thin and yellow, The kind of morning that promises nothing but an ordinary day. Except the ordinary didn't exist here. Not anymore. I moved like a man walking through a storm, slowly, deliberately, checking every latch, every window. The handprint on the door was gone. Only a smear of dried dark remained like a stain on a memory. The carved words on the aluminum were still there, stubborn and absurd. I see you, Aaron. They were iron in my mouth, a taste I couldn't wash away. I left the RV. The campground had its waking sounds. Low conversation from the far loop, a generator whining, a child's cry stitched into the distance. But the cedars hummed in a different register. Up close, they seemed to breathe in and out with the sort of patience that predated humans. My feet found the path without thinking, the hollow a muscle memory I'd developed in a single terrified night. The scrap of paper in my pocket had gone warm, like a living thing. As I pushed through the thin curtain of trees, the hollow revealed itself again, like a mouth opening. The stump sat like a throne in the center, its carved surface glistening with sap shaped into unfamiliar sigils. The little offerings, stones, a broken lens, the plastic horse, still lay where I had left them, and the paper I'd tucked into my pocket the day before fluttered now at the stump's edge as if it had breath. I crouched, fingers hovering over it, and hesitated. This time the wind changed. Not a breeze, but an alteration in density, the kind of shift you feel in your lungs before a storm. The cedar needles brushed together, a susurration like cloth on cloth. And then a child's voice sang, so close to my ear I had to choke back a cry. "Do you see back?" it asked. The words were syllables stitched from a dozen small sounds, unfamiliar in their cadence. The voice merged with the wind, with the sap and earth, as if it were less a human sound and more a language the forest had learned by repetition. "Do you look for us?" I answered out of habit, because people answer voices even when answering feels like a betrayal. "Who are you?" My own voice sounded small, like someone speaking into a cave. A laugh, thin and bright, answered then slid into something older. "We remember, we watch, we keep. What do you want?" A sane person would have left. A sane person would have driven to town, but like called someone, gone to the sheriff, and told a ridiculous story that would be laughed at over coffee. But fears are tricky. They make you stay where you can see the thing that scares you, rather than run into the unknown. The stump held its silence for a long second. Then a small movement answered. No figure, just a ripple in the air as if the light itself tilted. A twig cracked behind me, and I spun. Baxter's ears were pinned, teeth bared at nothing. His body was a taut wire. He emitted a low whine that pried my scalp. When I turned back to the stump, a scrap of something fluttered from the base and landed at my feet, a photograph, curled and damp. I picked it up. A face stared back at me, faded by sun and time. A child, hair-cropped, grin undone by the blankness of the eyes. On the back, in handwriting like the one on the paper, a single line, "Don't let us sleep." The world narrowed to that sentence. Every tale of woods I'd ever been told, half-remembered warnings, jokes that bore teeth, came sliding into place. There was a line in mountain lore about places that keep things, about how the land would adopt names and faces because people had been careless with grief. I'd never believed it, not really. I was a man who fixed water pumps and read tire tread, not a believer in old stories. But now, with a child's photograph damp in my hand and the cedar sap sticky on my skin, belief felt less like surrender and more like survival. Something moved high in the trees. A ripple of shadow that might have been a limb or might have been a shape leaning out to watch. I felt the hair on my neck stand up as if the forest itself had a spine. The whispering voice, a chorus now, pressed against me. "You see us," it said. The pronoun felt possessive, like an ownership claim. "You remember." Memory is a tricky thing. It can make monsters out of barren facts, and it can forget whole lives by mistake. I found myself thinking of the things I'd left unsaid in my life. My father's tombstone, only a name, no ceremony. A friend I'd argued with before he died in some flat, stupid way. A small kindness I'd meant to return and never had. Guilt is a magnet in these places. It draws you closer to whatever energy is loose and hungry. Maybe that's why this place had named me. Maybe that's why it wanted me to stay. I stuffed the photograph into my pocket and stood. "If you remember," I said, steadier than I felt, "then what do you want me to remember?" A long silence. Then, like a slow tide, the branches above me separated, and two small, pale reflections blinked down from a high crotch of cedar, eyes bright and round. They watched with an intelligence that curdled my gut. "We sleep and you wake. You call our names and the land keeps time with you," like said the voices. "You left things. We keep what's left. We ask nothing. We keep." The language circled meaning rather than giving it. I could feel the edges of it like thorns catching at my clothes. And then, quieter, as if the forest were blushing, it added, "Not yet." "Not yet what?" I asked. "Not yet returned," it answered. The words were blunt and soft at once. "You must promise to remember, to tell." "To tell who?" I stammered. "Who would I tell? Who would believe me? The sheriff with his coffee breath? Some stranger at a diner? How could I explain that the trees kept a ledger of people and that the ledger wanted to talk?" "You will tell," the cedars sang. "Tell in a way that finds ears. Return with us." The final syllable stretched, not a command but an invocation. I thought of the carved eyes in the bark, of the painted handprints, of the small offerings at the stump. I thought of the paper that had told me, "Don't leave, not yet." The words had an aftertaste like a bargain. Not leave until what? Until I told their story? Until I acknowledged them? Did saying their names free them? Or bind me to them? Baxter nudged my hand, grounding me in the ordinary, a living, warm dog, not an echo or a handwriting. His eyes were imploring. He wanted to run. He wanted to be out of this place that spoke in riddles. I found myself promising, not because I believed in bargains, but because the cedar's idea of time had a slow, antique cruelty. The way the world was here, sticky with sap and old grief, suggested that bargains might be the only currency left. I promised to remember. I promised to tell, to find ears that would listen. The cedars accepted it with the lightest of sighs, like a tide easing from the shore. When I climbed back to the campground, the sky had gone heavy and low. The other rigs were stirring, people moving in ordinary patterns of coffee and sandals. I felt like a man who'd been to the bottom of something and come back with water in his lungs. The carved words on my RV gleamed faintly in the late light. I ran my fingers across them again and felt them like a pulse. That evening, I tried to do ordinary things. I washed the sap from my hands with cold water until the skin wrinkled. I spoke aloud to myself until my voice sounded familiar again. I scanned the horizon for any normality I could bank on. A road crew, a pickup, a kid with a fishing pole. But the cedars held their own counsel. At dusk, the laughter returned, but softer, threaded with a melancholy that did not want to harm so much as to be acknowledged. When the knocks came this time, they were not hollow acts of menace, but a rhythm like someone tapping out a name. I sat on my steps and let the sounds wash over me, cataloging them like evidence, letting my mind file them away for telling later. Later. That word settled in me like a stone. The watcher watched, and I would watch back, not with the hard eyes of someone who wanted to fight, but with the stubborn, human need to carry a story so it did not die in the dark. If memory was what the cedars demanded, then I would give it memory. If the land wanted binding, I would bind it with truth. I didn't know what that would cost. I only knew that somewhere in the deep geometry of the woods, the cedars were waiting, and that my next step would either be a confession or a surrender. Either way, I was no longer a casual camper. I had names to remember. I had a promise to keep, and the watcher, patient and patient as it was, would wait until I learned how to speak for it. I promised the cedars I would tell. Saying the words into the hollow didn't make me lighter. If anything, it felt heavier, like lifting a net full of fish and realizing you still had to carry them home. But promises are actions in waiting, and action was what I needed. So at dawn, I hitched up, not to leave, but to go find ears. The closest town was Ogden, Rick had said. half an hour down a canyon that felt farther when you carried something in your pockets. I drove with the windows down, even though the air smelled like cedar, no matter how far I drove, as if the place had leapt into my cab and parked itself next to me. Baxter lay splayed on the bench, ragged from the nights and too alert for his own good, glancing up at me as if to ask whether I really meant what I said to the trees. In town, I moved like someone trying on a new skin. I went into the country store first because that's where truth often hangs out, on handwritten notes tacked beneath the coffee counter in the pause before a townsperson answers a question. The bell over the door jangled. The owner looked up, flat-eyed, like everyone here had seen things the Cedars made and learned how to fold that knowledge away. "Morning," I said, clearing my throat. "Name's Aaron. I was camping up near Causey. You know that place?" He wiped a cup with a rag, slow. "We know it," he said without inflection. "You from around here?" No. I'd learned in one breath to not give the whole story at once. People draw lines. But I had an experience there. I'm looking for anyone who knows the history. Any old papers, maybe an older resident who remembers kids playing up there years ago. Anything. He set the cup down and finally looked at me. For the first time, his face softened, not pity so much as the recognition of someone who'd crossed into a private hurt. "There's an old woman, Maggie Hales, used to live on the ridge above the reservoir. She keeps to herself, knows more town stories than the library. Folks say she keeps a ledger of who's been lost and found." He pointed me toward a road that sloped up and away, a narrow spine of pavement that turned to dust at its edges. "If anyone's got ears for cedar talk, it's Maggie." I found Maggie's place perched on a slight rise, its porch sagging like the town itself had grown too tired to hold everything upright. She was smaller than I expected, all angles and eyes, hair the color of old rope. When I told her the truth about the knocks, the eyes, the handprints, she didn't laugh or call the sheriff. She only listened, chin propped on a fist, as if she were settling in for a long story that had been waiting for the right ears. "My brother," she said after a long silence, "went missing when he was 7, went out to play near the Cedars and never came back." Her voice folded into the quiet like a careful thing. "That was 40 years ago. They looked for him until there were no tracks left to follow. Folks moved on, or thought they had. But the land doesn't forget the names you forget." "Did they find him?" I asked. The question felt childish, like asking whether an old wound ever stopped hurting. Maggie's laugh was a thin wire. "Find? No. Some say he joined the trees. Some say the trees returned him and took him back. People make up things to sleep." Her fingers drummed the wood of her knee. "But there were others. A girl who never came back with her dog. A boy who drowned and was found with twigs braided into his hair. Names that people still mumble when they think no one's listening." She fetched a box from under her bed, grubby with years of handling, and from it pulled yellowed clippings tied with string. Each headline was the same small-town grief. "Search continues at Causey Reservoir, boy missing, last seen at campground." I read them all with my palms sweating, the paper rough against my fingers. Dates stacked like a slow judgment. 1979, 1984, 1992. The last entry in the stack had no name, just an account of a child who vanished in a storm, and they'd closed the case because there was nothing else to do. "Why tell me?" I asked finally. "Why now?" Maggie's eyes, small and sharp, met mine, and for a moment I felt like a man being peered into by a cat. "Because they're asking," she said simply, "and because you were named. The trees take what's offered. They know when someone remembers. They want to be remembered proper. Maybe they need someone who can put words where they can't." She slid a photograph across the table. It was of a group of kids by the reservoir, sunburned noses and slack smiles. There, half hidden by a smear of mud, was a small figure with a haircut like the child in the photo I'd found in the hollow. "That's my brother," she said. "You can keep the clippings if you promise to tell the truth." I promised. Not because the promise would change anything the Cedars themselves did, but because promises, like stories, demand a witness. Maggie became my witness. She gave me directions to an old cemetery on a low knoll where there'd once been a picnic ground, to a woman who'd been a ranger, to a minister who kept church records. The town grew into a map of voices, each pointing me back toward the Cedars in their own way. What surprised me most was the accumulation of small concrete things. An old shoe found behind a root, a toy boat lodged in a hollow log, a name carved into a rock that no one could explain. When I put Maggie's clippings beside the photograph from the hollow, the faces lined up. The same children, different angles, different seasons. Names that would not let themselves be dismissed. The word remember took on body. I drove back like a man carrying an inheritance he hadn't asked for. The Cedars waited for me in the same patient gloom. I had boxes of names now, a list heavy in my glove compartment. I had elders' accounts and a photograph that matched the one on the stump. I had a promise and the feeling of a debt I couldn't pay with money. What I had to offer was words. Stories spoken into the waiting dark so that the dead, or whatever lived in those trees, might be allowed to keep their history as history and not as hunger. That evening, I did what Maggie had suggested. I prepared a small altar on the stump. I set out the photograph she'd given me, the clipping that mentioned the boy who'd never been found, the scrap of paper I'd taken from the hollow, and a candle I'd bought in Ogden because flames always make a pact feel more official. I arranged the objects like a janitor shelving mementos of care, careful, reverent, awkward. The Cedars closed ranks above me, a cathedral without an architect. The air tasted of iron and rain that had not fallen, and the shadows moved as if some presence was rearranging itself to listen. I took a breath and told their names aloud. One by one, I spoke the words, the names that had been tucked into town memory like seeds in pockets. I told the story as best I could of boats and picnics and storms, of children's laughter and how it had been cut off mid-sentence, of footprints that stopped in the middle of a line. My voice was small at first, but as the list grew longer, my tone steadied. There is a strange clarity that comes when you read a ledger aloud. The names become less abstract, more human. As I spoke, the air shifted. The laughter that used to set my teeth on edge now threaded with something else. Recognition, maybe, or a relief I could not have imagined. The taps in the bark stilled. For the first time since the first knock, I felt like I wasn't the only one in the room with the story. When I finished, I placed my palm on the stump and felt the sap there, warm and yielding. Above, the cedars shivered, sending down a soft rain of needles. In the hollow, a single thing moved. The small plastic horse, which had been faded and buried, rolled as if nudged by an invisible thumb. Then a voice, so close to my ear it could have been a breath, said simply, "Thank you." It wasn't the laugh. It wasn't the mockery. It was a small, childlike sound that quivered with something like gratitude. The cedars seemed to exhale. The pressure that had been pressing at the edges of my mind eased by a degree. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd done the right thing. Maybe stories mattered here. Maybe memories were a currency that could buy a measure of peace. But the cedars are old and their bargains are not so simple. As I rose to leave, a movement in the trunk caught my peripheral vision. Not eyes now, more like a face molded into bark, a suggestion of mouth that shaped itself into a shape of its own. It watched me with an intensity that had nothing to do with gratitude. "Not yet," it said, this time not as a request, but as an instruction. Not yet given back. I felt the word like a hand on my shoulder. The promise I'd made bent into something longer and more complex. I had spoken their names. I had given them the story. But the trees, watcher, keeper, whatever you wanted to call it, had not finished. When I walked back to the RV that night, Baxter close at my heels, the carved message on the aluminum gleamed in the lantern light as if newly polished. "I see you, Aaron." The letters no longer felt merely like a threat. They were a contract. I had read the ledger. The Cedars had accepted that someone would carry the names. Now the terms were being written in real time. I slept that night in fits, dreams braided with sap and small hands reaching through the dark. When I woke, the sky was the hard gray of something unfinished. The cedars, patient and relentless, had an appetite that could be sated only by the slow work of remembrance, and perhaps I thought with a cold new clarity by what came after remembering. I drove slowly down the canyon road the next morning, the RV humming beneath me like a living thing aware of the pact I'd made. Every bend in the asphalt, every shadow between the cedars reminded me that I wasn't leaving yet. Not really. The watcher had not released me. It had only extended a thread, a fragile line connecting my memory to its patience. I stopped at the overlook where the canyon curved, giving me a view of the reservoir spread like glass beneath the trees. The air was cold and still, the kind of morning that smells of water and stone and secrets half forgotten. Baxter whined softly, as if he knew that the sense of unease was not mine alone. I stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, and looked toward the cedar grove in the distance. The trees seemed to watch, but differently now. Not with accusation, not with hunger, but with expectation. Their branches swayed faintly, teasing the light, and I could swear the shadows formed patterns. Faces, hands, eyes, all of them converging, waiting for the story to be carried, for the names to travel. I reached into my bag and pulled out the collection of photographs and clippings I'd gathered. One by one, I read the names aloud. Children who had vanished, the boy with the braided twigs, the girl with her dog, all the others Maggie had helped me piece together. My voice carried across the canyon, thin but steady, a human current through the old tree's patience. For a moment, nothing responded. Then, faint at first, the whispers began. The sibilant sighs of wind threading through branches, shaping themselves into half-formed syllables. I knew I couldn't understand them fully, but I could feel the cadence, thankful, soft, insistently alive. The cedars had accepted the recital. They had acknowledged that someone remembered, that someone bore the ledger of their absence, and yet I could feel it still, the unfinished weight. Not a threat, but a tether, a reminder that the watcher did not yield lightly. The carved eyes I'd seen in the trunks flickered in my mind as if I could see them reflected in every ripple of the water below. The handprints, the words on the RV, the paper in the hollow, they were markers of a debt I had begun to pay, but not yet completed. I turned back to the road, feeling the tight pull of responsibility settle deep into my chest. Each mile I put between the campground and the town was measured not in distance but in attention. The forest's gaze followed me, patient and enduring. I understood now it was not merely about fear. It was about memory, about bearing witness. It was about carrying the names, the stories, the lives that the land had taken but refused to let go. In the rearview mirror, the cedar grove receded, smaller now but still imposing, still alive with quiet intelligence. Baxter's head rested against the seat, eyes half closed yet alert. I felt a solemn connection to him. I was not alone in keeping watch. We had become carriers, guardians of the ledger, witnesses to the enduring patience of the land. And I knew as I drove on that the story was only beginning. The cedars, the watcher, the hidden ledger, they would remain, and so would I. I had been named, and I would not forget. The road stretched ahead, lined with ordinary trees and fields and towns, yet I carried the extraordinary within me, the memory of eyes in the bark, of handprints on aluminum, of the hollow where the forest had whispered my name. And I knew that one day, when the night was quiet and the wind brushed across the cedars, I would return. Not as a visitor, not as a camper, but as someone who remembered. Because the watcher in cedars does not forget. And neither can I. The night I returned to the campground, it was colder than I remembered. The air sharp enough to draw the forest into focus. The RV's tires crunched over frostbitten gravel as I parked in the same spot, but the place felt different now. Not simply alive, but awake, deliberate, aware of me as something more than a visitor. Baxter jumped down, paws sliding on the hard ground, tail low but alert. He glanced toward the cedars as if expecting movement, and I understood. So did I. I left the engine running. That rhythm of vibration, that soft hum, was comforting in a place where the world could twist and the forest could breathe. I stepped toward the hollow. The air smelled of damp earth, cedar, and something older, almost like smoke from a fire that had never burned. The stump waited, patient as the world itself. I placed the photographs, the clippings, and the scraps of paper carefully in the hollow. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the gravity of the act. The forest had demanded witness, and now I was giving it with every ounce of my presence. I spoke the names again, slowly, deliberately, letting them roll off my tongue as if I were tracing each syllable into the air, into the soil, into the cedar canopy above. The wind shifted, and I heard it. 1,000 tiny movements in the branches, the faint rustle of leaves that sounded almost like applause. The watcher had arrived. Not a shadow, not a figure, but a presence, vast and patient, settling in the hollow with me. The eyes I had imagined were real in a way that didn't need form. They existed in the subtle sway of branches, the pressure in the air, the way the forest held its breath and waited. "You remember," a voice breathed, close to my ear, not spoken aloud, but pressed into the marrow of my bones. "Yes," I said, "I remember. I will tell. I will keep the names." The voice laughed then, soft and relieved, threading through the branches like wind. "Then you are ready." I felt a weight lift. Not gone entirely, but shifted. The watcher's patience was infinite, but the ledger I carried now had a pulse. The carvings in the aluminum, the handprints, the hollow, they were no longer threats. They were reminders that the past had teeth, yes, but also that it could be honored, carried, and returned through memory. I spent the night there, sitting at the hollow, talking softly to the forest, recounting the stories of the children, of the vanished, of those who had slipped through the cracks of the world. The cedars leaned close, listening, shaping themselves around my voice, and in their shadows, I felt the presence of every child who had been lost there, finally acknowledged. By dawn, the frost had melted, and the first light of sun made the grove glow faintly gold. The RV stood behind me, ordinary again, yet I knew the truth. I would never see it as ordinary again. The watcher had taught me patience, observation, and the weight of memory. I packed the RV slowly, reverently, knowing that leaving was no longer a flight from fear, but a continuation of responsibility. Every mile I drove away from Causey Reservoir, every town I passed, I carried the ledger with me, not as a burden, but as a story, a duty, a gift. The watcher had named me, and in return, I would bear witness. And in the quiet stretches of road, when the forest fell back into the distance, I still felt eyes on me. Not menacing eyes, not hungry, but attentive, waiting for the story to be told, the names to be spoken, the memory to be honored. I had become the keeper, the forest demanded. The watcher's presence lingered, patient and eternal, threading through the cedars and into me. I drove on, knowing that this story, my story, would never truly end. The forest had given me a purpose as old as memory itself, to see, to remember, to tell. And even now, when the night falls and shadows stretch long across the road, I can still hear the faintest whisper, patient, soft, insistent. "You remember, Aaron, you remember." And I do. The watcher waits, and so do I. I've always believed that the wilds of Alaska hold more secrets than any map or ranger station will ever admit. My name is Daniel Price. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Montana, but I've spent the last decade traveling across the United States in my RV. I thought I had seen every kind of wilderness, every lonely highway and dark forest road. But Alaska has a way of swallowing you whole, and it doesn't always spit you back out. I learned this the hard way, not from something that happened to me directly, but from the stories that started to follow me, shadowing every stop I made across the Alaskan backcountry. RVers like me, people just chasing the same dream of freedom and open space, had been vanishing here. No skid marks, no broken glass, no overturned campers. Just gone. The first time I heard about it, I was parked outside Talk, near a small gravel turnout where a handful of other rigs had settled for the night. It was early June, the sun barely dipping below the horizon before rising again. I was sitting by my fire ring, listening to the faint hum of mosquitoes in the air, when an older man with a beat-up Class C approached me. His name was Walter, 70s maybe, wiry, with hands that trembled even when he was still. "You traveling alone?" he asked me, his eyes flicking to the shadows beyond my firelight. I nodded. "Yeah, been solo for a while." "Why?" Walter lowered himself into the folding chair across from me and leaned in. "Then you better keep your head on a swivel. You know how many folks go missing out here every year? Whole RVs, son, not just hikers who wandered off. RVs, trailers, vans, parked one night, gone the next." I thought he was exaggerating. I had heard about hikers disappearing into the millions of acres of untamed land. Sure, but entire RVs? That sounded like one of those wild campfire stories meant to spook newcomers. I told him as much, and he just shook his head, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "You'll see," he said, staring into the flames. "Out here, you don't vanish because you're lost. You vanish because something was looking for you." I laughed it off at the time, but his words burrowed into me. That night, as the silence deepened and the forest pressed close, I found myself listening for things I shouldn't have. Footsteps, whispers, the creak of metal where there should be none. And when I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of my RV being slowly pulled backwards into the trees, tires leaving no tracks, my own breath locked in my throat. The next morning, Walter was gone. His Class C, his chair, his fire ring. Nothing remained but a patch of flattened grass where he'd been. I told myself he'd just left early. People do that all the time, but part of me couldn't help but notice that he hadn't said goodbye, hadn't made a sound. One moment he was there. The next, like so many others in these parts, he wasn't. I tried to shake it off as I made my way deeper into the backcountry, but the stories followed. In Talk, in Fairbanks, down near Denali, everywhere I stopped, locals and fellow travelers whispered about disappearances. A young couple from Anchorage who had been camping near the Susitna River. A retired veteran who had parked his Airstream off a logging road. A family with 2 kids last seen outside a small grocery store in Talkeetna. None of them were ever found. What unsettled me most wasn't just the vanishings, it was the way people talked about them. Not with shock or confusion, but with a heavy kind of acceptance, like it was simply part of life up here. Bears, mosquitoes, vanishing RVers. Alaska's trinity of inevitabilities. One night near Denali, I camped beside a woman named Karen. She was in her late 30s, traveling with her teenage son in a small fifth wheel. She had the kind of confidence that comes from years on the road, but when I asked her about the disappearances, her smile faltered. "My brother vanished," she told me softly, staring past me at the tree line. 3 years ago. He was parked with friends on a logging spur up north. They went fishing that morning. By the time they came back, his RV was gone. No tracks, no noise, nothing. They thought maybe he'd just packed up and left without telling them, but all his gear was still there. His cooler, his tackle box, his boots. Her voice caught, and I saw her son stiffen beside her. "We waited 2 weeks for answers," she whispered. "We're still waiting." That was when I realized these weren't just campfire tales. They were lived tragedies, spread across the wilderness like a pattern too vast to ignore. And I couldn't help but feel that I was driving straight into its center. Alaska is different from anywhere else I've traveled. The air feels heavier, the silence sharper. The trees don't just stand there. They loom, bending toward you when you're not looking. The rivers run wide and fast, as if eager to carry secrets downstream. At night, the sun never fully sets, but the half-darkness is worse than true black. It tricks your eyes, makes you see movement where there is none, shadows shifting without a source. One evening, I pulled into an unmarked clearing off the Denali Highway, miles from the nearest town. I was exhausted, my hands sore from gripping the wheel, my mind hazy from the endless stretches of gravel road. The place looked safe enough, flat ground, a circle of trees, and a view of snow-capped peaks in the distance. I leveled my rig, set out my chair, and let the quiet settle around me. But as dusk pressed in, I noticed something strange. About 30 yards beyond my firelight, in the underbrush, the ground looked disturbed. Not like animal tracks or fallen branches, more like the impression of tires. Deep, wide grooves that curved sharply into the woods and vanished. I told myself it was just another camper who had come through earlier. But the marks were fresh, the edges crisp, as if whatever made them had passed only hours ago. And yet there was no road, no trail, nothing but thick trees that should have stopped any vehicle dead in its tracks. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something scraping lightly against the metal sides of my RV. Not claws, not branches, something more deliberate, almost careful. Once I thought I heard my own name whispered through the thin aluminum walls, carried by a voice that wasn't mine. When morning came, I stumbled outside, half expecting to see claw marks or dents in the metal. But my rig was untouched. Only the tire impressions remained, leading deeper into the trees. And this time I noticed something else. A single camping chair, weather-beaten and broken, lying half buried in moss just beyond the tracks. I didn't stay long enough to study it. I packed up in a rush, my hands trembling, my chest tight. And as I drove away, the rearview mirror showed me something I still can't explain. For just a second, I thought I saw another RV, identical to mine, parked in that same clearing, smoke curling from its chimney. Then the trees closed in and it was gone. That was the moment I realized Alaska wasn't just dangerous because of its wilderness, its bears, or its freezing rivers. It was dangerous because something here had learned how to erase people. Something old, patient, and precise. And I was closer to it than I wanted to admit. I told myself I'd shake it off, that I was letting stories, whispers, and long nights twist my mind. But as I pushed farther north, the silence began to feel heavier, as though the land itself had been listening to me, memorizing my steps, waiting for a moment when I would falter. When you drive the Denali Highway, you learn quickly that there are no shoulders to lean on. Just a ribbon of gravel stretched across tundra and spruce, with mountain ranges shouldering the horizon like stone walls. Civilization disappears behind you in increments. First gas stations, then grocery stores, then cell service, until finally it's just you and the road the road doesn't care if you come back. I stopped again near Cantwell, pulling into a turnout where a hand-painted sign read simply, "Camp here at your own risk." I thought it was some kind of local joke, but when I stepped out of my rig, the wind carried something sharp and metallic on the air, like rust or blood that had been sitting too long in the sun. It caught in the back of my throat, bitter and sour at the same time. That night, I built a fire and tried to relax. The embers pulsed red, throwing shadows onto the nearby spruce. And that's when I noticed movement, quick, darting, but deliberate. Shapes pacing just outside the light's reach. I told myself it was wildlife. Wolves, maybe. But the longer I watched, the more I realized the shapes didn't move like animals. They moved upright, slow, watching, waiting. I stood, my chest tight, my eyes straining to pierce the dark. But when I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it outward, the clearing was empty. The smell of rust was gone. Only the silence remained. So complete, it made the ringing in my ears louder than my own heartbeat. When I finally crawled into my RV, I locked every latch and bolted the door. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around 2 a.m, something knocked. Once. Twice. Not frantic, just steady. The sound came from the back panel, where my bed pressed against the RV wall. 3 sharp raps like knuckles on hollow metal. I froze, every muscle locking tight. The sound didn't come again, but I couldn't close my eyes after that. Not until dawn broke across the ridgeline and the birds began to stir. When I finally stepped outside, there were no footprints, no paw prints, only 3 faint indentations in the metal skin of my RV, each one the size of a human fist. By then, I knew I needed to get off the Denali stretch. But Alaska doesn't let you escape easily. Roads twist back on themselves, towns are hours apart, and gas disappears faster than you think. I pushed east, hoping to reach Paxson, but somewhere along that endless drive, I passed an RV pulled onto the side of the road. It was old, a faded Winnebago with curtains drawn tight across every window. Something about it made me slow down. I pulled to a stop a few yards ahead and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots too loud in the stillness. The Winnebago's door hung slightly open, swaying with the breeze. "Hello?" I called out. No answer. The smell hit me next. Stale, damp, like a basement that had been closed for decades. Inside, the air was heavy, the silence pressing against my eardrums. Plates still sat on the tiny table as though someone had left in the middle of dinner. A jacket was draped across the couch. A pair of hiking boots sat neatly by the door. But there were no people. No signs of struggle, only dust. Thick layers of it covering every surface, as though no one had stepped inside for years. And yet, the coffee in the pot was still warm. My stomach lurched. I backed out quickly, my hands shaking so badly, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. When I climbed back into my own RV, I didn't even look in the mirrors. I didn't want to see if something had followed me out of that abandoned rig. Hours later, when I finally pulled into Paxson, I found a small lodge and diner. One of those places where the floors creak and the windows frost at the corners, even in June. I sat at the counter, still rattled, my coffee trembling in my grip. That's when the waitress, a woman with gray hair tied back in a bun, leaned toward me. "You look like you've seen the dead," she said. I almost laughed, but something in her tone stopped me. "I passed a Winnebago on the Denali," I admitted. Door was open. Place looked like it had been empty for years. But the coffee pot was still hot. Her face drained of color. She set the coffee pot down and whispered, "That RV's been there since 1998. The room tilted beneath me. My hands slipped on the mug and I burned myself on the scalding coffee. But the heat was nothing compared to the ice crawling down my spine. She didn't say anything else, and I didn't ask. Some things in Alaska you learn not to push. Some stories you don't finish because the ending is already written in the silence. That night, in the tiny lodge parking lot, I locked my doors again and sat in the dark, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself I could leave in the morning, head south, get out of this cursed loop. But sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside. Footsteps. Slow, circling my rig. I sat frozen, every muscle rigid as the sound scraped around me, gravel shifting beneath weight. 1 lap, 2 laps, 3. The 4th time the steps stopped by my door. A pause stretched long enough to break me, and then 3 soft knocks, just like before. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My chest screamed for air, but I held it, praying the silence would make me invisible. Minutes passed. Then the footsteps retreated, fading into nothing. When morning came, there were no prints, no signs, only the faint smell of rust clinging to the air. By then I understood what Walter had told me back in talk. Out here, people don't vanish because they're lost. They vanish because something is hunting them. Something that doesn't leave behind bodies or wreckage, just silence and stories. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was next. I should have left Alaska then. I should have turned my rig south and taken the first ferry I could find out of Whittier or Haines. But fear doesn't always drive you away. It can pull you deeper, rooting you in place like you're tethered to the very thing you want to escape. That's what happened to me. The more the stories stacked up, the more I wanted answers. Rationality whispered that there had to be explanations, hidden roads, human predators, the sheer immensity of the land. But somewhere in me, a darker voice insisted that if I left without knowing, I'd carry the weight of unfinished terror forever. So instead of fleeing south, I went north again. I drove the Richardson Highway toward Delta Junction, the road stretching like a scar across the land. My headlights cut through twilight, but the shadows beyond the beams seemed alive, bending and shifting as though they recognized me. Every few miles, I'd pass a turnout with tire ruts that ended abruptly at the tree line, as if someone had driven straight into the forest and disappeared. At one of these turnouts, I stopped. The ground was soft, the grooves deep, as though something massive had been dragged backward into the trees. When I crouched down, I noticed something embedded in the dirt. half buried, coated with mud. I brushed it off and froze. It was a key, a worn RV key bent at the end, still attached to a small leather fob stamped with the word Bounder. I pocketed it without thinking. My hands shook as I climbed back into my rig. The entire drive to Delta, I kept touching it, feeling its weight. A key without a door, a key that had belonged to someone who had never been seen again. In Delta Junction, I parked at a rundown RV park run by a man named Ray. He was in his 50s, gruff, with a thick beard and eyes that never quite looked at you straight on. Over cheap coffee in his office, I asked if he'd heard about missing RVers. His jaw tightened. "We don't talk about that," he muttered. "Why not?" "Because talking makes it worse." He leaned in close, lowering his voice. "They say once you know, it knows you back, and then you're marked." I didn't want to believe him, but my stomach turned as he said it. Because I'd already felt marked. Since talk, since Walter's vanishing act, since the tire ruts in the Winnebago, something had been trailing me, just out of sight. That night, I parked in the gravel lot behind Ray's office. I didn't build a fire, didn't leave a light on. I sat in the dark, holding that bent key in my fist, listening. Around midnight, the air shifted. It wasn't sound exactly, not at first. It was pressure, a heaviness pressing against the walls of my RV. Then came the scratching, faint at first, like twigs dragging across the siding, then sharper, metal on metal. I crept to the back window, heart pounding, and peeled the curtain just enough to see. Nothing. Only the empty lot, Ray's office dark in the distance. I let the curtain fall. That's when I heard the door handle jiggle. I spun, staring at the door. The deadbolt shook once. Then again, slow, testing, not like an animal, not frantic. This was careful, intentional. I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, my cast iron skillet, and stood frozen in the middle of my RV, sweat dripping down my neck. The handle rattled one more time, then silence. I waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into sleep. When I woke, the door was still locked. No scratches, no dents. But lying on the step outside was something that hadn't been there before. Another key. This one was newer, still shiny, with a black plastic head. A Ford logo stamped across it. I didn't pick it up. I just stared, bile rising in my throat. Because the message was clear, whatever was out there had been inside someone else's RV last night, and it was leaving me breadcrumbs. The next morning, Ray's office was locked up tight, his truck gone. No note. No explanation, just vanished. I was alone again. I drove on, the road narrower, lonelier, every mile heavier than the last. Somewhere outside of North Pole, I pulled into another turnout. This one wasn't marked, but it had the remnants of a fire pit, charcoal scattered, beer cans rusted in the grass, evidence of people who had been here once. I sat there for hours, staring at the tree line, waiting for something to show itself, but nothing came. It was when I finally closed my eyes that I heard it. A voice, faint but clear. Daniel. My name. It came from the trees, not shouted, not whispered, just spoken, like someone standing 20 feet away. I opened my eyes. My hands trembled as I reached for the skillet again, my throat dry as sandpaper. Daniel. The voice came again, this time from behind my RV. I stumbled to the rear window, yanking the curtain. Nothing, just endless spruce and tundra bending in the breeze. I backed away, chest heaving. Then the voice came a third time, from directly outside the door. I didn't open it. I couldn't. But when I finally looked down at the floor by the entrance, I saw something that hadn't been there before. Another key. This one wasn't for a vehicle. It was old, iron, heavy. A skeleton key, the kind you'd expect to find in some century-old farmhouse. I stared at it until my vision blurred. My chest ached, as though the air itself had turned solid. And in that moment, I realized what the disappearances meant. People weren't just being taken. They were being unlocked. One by one, whatever lived out here was collecting the keys, opening doors that weren't supposed to open, and now it had mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the table in my rig, every light on, skillet in my lap, keys spread out before me. Bounder, Ford, skeleton, my own. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, but beneath it I thought I heard something else. A door creaking, hinges groaning, a sound that didn't belong to the forest at all. By the time I reached Fairbanks, I hadn't slept more than 2 or 3 hours in days. My hands shook constantly, the nerves in my arms buzzing as if I'd been drinking coffee without pause. Every time I parked, every time I turned off the ignition, I waited for the quiet to become something else, the scratching, the voice, the weight of eyes in the trees. Fairbanks should have been a relief, a return to civilization. But even in town, the shadows clung to me. I parked at a small RV lot near the Chena River, surrounded by rigs packed close together, the glow of porch lights scattering across gravel. Yet, instead of safety, I felt watched more than ever. Crowds don't always mean protection. Sometimes they mean camouflage. That evening, I struck up a conversation with a man named Elias, parked 2 spaces down in a truck camper. He was Alaskan-born, early 50s, broad shoulders, and eyes that carried the kind of wariness you only see in people who know what the wilderness really is. Over a beer, I asked him about the vanishings. He didn't blink. He didn't smirk, didn't brush it off like rumor. He just nodded. "You found the keys, didn't you?" The blood drained from my face. "How did you?" "Everyone marked finds them eventually," he said flatly. "That's how it starts." I wanted to ask more, but before I could, Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping low enough that the hum of the nearby generator nearly swallowed it. "They're not disappearances," he whispered. "They're collections. The land takes what it's owed, but it doesn't take randomly. It hunts travelers, the ones who don't belong, the ones who keep moving. It pulls them through the locks they don't even see." "What does that mean?" I asked. He just shook his head. "Don't follow the keys. Don't acknowledge them. That's how it knows you're willing." I wanted to laugh it off, to say this was just another campfire tale. But I couldn't. Not after the skeleton key, not after hearing my own name carried on air too heavy to be wind. That night, I locked myself inside and sat upright in my bed, every light on. Around 2 a.m, I heard the sound again. 3 slow knocks on the back panel, followed by the soft scrape of something metal sliding across the door frame. When I finally worked up the nerve to check in the morning, there was a new key lying on the step. Small, brass, polished to a shine, and engraved with a number, 27. I didn't pick it up. Not this time. I slammed the door and drove out of Fairbanks without looking back, my chest hammering, my mouth dry. The road north narrowed, the land growing wilder, lonelier, as if I was slipping past the edge of a map. I told myself I'd head toward the Dalton Highway, maybe even turn around. But the deeper I went, the more the keys pressed on my mind. Every mile, I felt the weight of them in my pocket, even though I'd left them on the table back in Fairbanks. It was as if carrying them wasn't a choice anymore. They were part of me. I stopped one evening at a turnout overlooking a river. The water moved dark and fast, like a ribbon of oil cutting through the land. I set up camp, but didn't light a fire. I didn't want to give anything out there the satisfaction of finding me lit up like a beacon. Still, they came. I woke in the dead of night to the sound of doors opening. Not one, not 2, dozens. Hinges creaking in the dark, one after another, like a hallway lined with entrances stretching far beyond my RV. I held my breath, my palms slick with sweat. Then came the voices. Not one voice this time, but many. A chorus, layered, repeating my name in different tones, different ages. "Daniel, Daniel." Some whispered, some sang. Some called as though from across a canyon. The air thickened until it felt like I was drowning. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the voices weren't outside. They were inside, vibrating in my skull. And then silence. When I dared to open my eyes again, there was light outside my window. Faint, flickering. Not headlights, not moonlight. Candlelight. Candlelight. Dozens of small flames scattered across the turnout, floating as though each were carried by unseen hands. I stumbled back from the window, shaking so hard I could barely breathe. But curiosity, or maybe madness, dragged me closer. I lifted the curtain again. The candles weren't just scattered, they were arranged in the shape of a key. By dawn, the candles were gone. The gravel was bare. But on the hood of my RV, resting perfectly centered, was the brass key marked 27. I drove for hours after that, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever had followed me. The road grew emptier, the forest closing in. The mountains loomed larger, like they'd been waiting for me all along. When I finally stopped for gas at a lonely station north of Livingood, the attendant, a man with sunken cheeks and eyes ringed dark, stared at me longer than was comfortable. "You've been marked," he said simply as he pumped the fuel. I tried to deny it, but the words stuck in my throat. "How do you know?" He tapped his chest pocket. Something jingled. He pulled out a ring heavy with keys, dozens of them, clinking together like bones. "Because I was too. Once." He handed me the receipt and leaned in close. "The trick isn't escaping. You can't. The trick is deciding which door you'll open first. Better you choose than let them do it for you." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to hear the answer. I drove off with the weight of his words pressing on my chest harder than any silence had before. But that night, as I parked miles from any town, I understood. Because when I shut off the engine, the keys were already waiting for me. Not on the step, not on the hood, but inside, spread neatly across my table, glinting in the dim light. Bounder, Ford, skeleton, brass 27, and now dozens more. Keys I had never seen before, keys to rigs I didn't recognize. Keys that carried names and stories I'd never know. And in the reflection of the RV's window, I swore I saw someone else sitting across from me, someone who looked exactly like me, holding a key of his own. I don't know how long I sat there that night, staring at the reflection in the window. My double sat across from me, his posture perfect, his eyes fixed on mine. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was delayed, a fraction of a second too slow, like a bad recording. When I lifted my hand, his followed, but not in sync. And in his other hand, he held the skeleton key, lifting it toward the invisible lock between us. I ripped the curtain shut and stumbled backward, my breath hitching, skillet slipping from my hands with a heavy clang. The sound echoed too long inside the RV, like the walls themselves were amplifying it. I told myself not to look again. I told myself to crawl into bed, to close my eyes, to ride out the hours until daylight. But when something inside your own home turns strange, you can't ignore it. You can't pretend it isn't happening. So I looked again. The window was empty. Just my own face, pale and shaking, staring back at me. The table was bare, no keys, no duplicates, just the trembling in my own hands. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it. That exhaustion had pushed me into some waking dream. But when I sat back down, I felt it, the weight of the skeleton key in my pocket. The one I swore I'd left behind in Fairbanks. That night, sleep didn't come. My body ached with the absence of rest, my head pounding, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The sound of locks turning, doors opening, somewhere close but not visible, as if the forest around me was filled with invisible thresholds, each one creaking wider as something stepped through. By morning, my decision was made for me. I couldn't just drive. I had to confront it, whatever it was. I turned north onto the Dalton Highway, the road that cuts across the Yukon River and runs all the way to Prudhoe Bay. Some call it the loneliest highway in America. Out there, if something goes wrong, help isn't hours away, it's days. But I didn't care. If the wilderness was going to claim me, I needed to see its face. The Dalton is a brutal stretch, gravel that rattles your bones, semis that blast past you in clouds of dust, bridges that shudder with every passing wheel. But the worst part is the silence. The further you drive, the less you hear. Even the birds fade away. The trees grow tall and black, their tops clawing at the sky. I stopped at the Yukon River Camp, a lonely outpost with a diner and fuel. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of grease and coffee. A trucker sat hunched at the counter, his hands wrapped around a mug like it was the last anchor holding him here. "You headed north?" he asked, his voice gravel. I nodded. "Don't stop on the pipeline road," he said. "And if you see lights where there shouldn't be, keep driving." I wanted to ask what he meant, but his eyes told me not to. They were hollow, rimmed in red, the eyes of a man who'd seen something he couldn't name. That night, I camped just off the Dalton in a pullout that looked across endless tundra. The sky burned pink and orange, refusing to go dark, but the light did nothing to comfort me. I set my chair outside, skillet in my lap, and waited. At first, nothing, just the wind sweeping across the brush. But then, near midnight, a flicker. Lights on the horizon. Not headlights, not stars. Cabin lights, glowing warm and gold, too high on a ridge where no road should reach. I remembered the trucker's warning. Keep driving. But I wasn't driving. I was sitting, waiting, daring something to show itself. The lights grew brighter, closer. My pulse quickened. And then I realized something that made my stomach twist. The lights weren't approaching me. They were matching me. Each time I shifted in my chair, the lights seemed to shift in kind, as if mirroring my movements. I stood, my breath fogging in the cool air. The lights flared, pulsed, then froze. And that's when I heard it. The faint jingle of keys carried on the wind, not one set, hundreds. A metallic chorus drifting across the tundra. I backed into my RV, slamming the door, locking it, bolting it. But the jingling didn't stop. It grew louder, pressing against the walls until the entire rig vibrated with the sound of unseen rings shaking, colliding, demanding. I covered my ears, screaming into the silence of my own skull. The noise didn't stop. It moved inside me, vibrating in my chest, rattling my bones. Then, just as suddenly, it ceased. The RV fell into silence. My own breath sounded like thunder. Slowly, I opened my eyes. The table was full again. Keys. Dozens more than before. Old, new, broken, pristine. Each one glinting in the dim light, arranged in perfect rows. At the center, the skeleton key gleamed, its teeth sharp as knives. I knew then what Elias had meant. They weren't just disappearances, they were collections. Each missing RVer had left behind a key. And now the land wasn't just collecting theirs, it was offering me mine. But a question chewed at me. What door were these keys meant for? Where did they lead? That night I dreamed. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe it was something else. I was standing in a hallway lined with doors. Rusted, wooden, steel, glass. Thousands of them stretching into the horizon, each one locked, each one whispering with voices behind it. In my hand was the skeleton key, and I knew, without doubt, that whichever door I chose would open, not just for me, but for whatever was waiting behind it. I woke with a scream, sweat dripping down my spine, and in my fist, clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palm, was the brass key marked 27. I hadn't picked it up, I hadn't touched it, but it was there. Waiting. By the time I crossed the Yukon River Bridge, I felt like I was no longer in Alaska. I was in something older, stranger, land that tolerated roads and travelers the way a bear tolerates flies buzzing near its ears. The Dalton cut northward like a wound, but the wilderness around it pressed back, whispering through the wind, bending the light, watching. Sleep came in fits. Every time my eyelids shut, I was back in that endless hallway, doors rattling, keys quivering in their locks, something scratching from the other side. My chest would seize, my throat would close, and I'd jolt awake to the creak of my RV's frame, convinced the whole rig was being lifted and carried off. I told myself I'd turn back at Coldfoot. That was the line I drew in my mind. Get gas, grab food, and run south as fast as I could. But the road had other plans. Near mile marker 175, I saw it. Another RV, parked at an angle on the shoulder, hazard lights off, door wide open. I slowed, hands slick on the wheel, pulse hammering. The sight was too familiar, too much like the Winnebago on the Denali. But this one wasn't dusty. It was clean, fresh, like it had just been abandoned. I pulled ahead, killed the engine, and stepped out. The silence hit me like a wall. No birds, no insects, just the sigh of wind dragging over the tundra. The RV was modern, maybe 5 years old at most, curtains drawn, a bike rack on the back, 2 mountain bikes still strapped in. On the table inside, I saw plates with food half-eaten, forks still resting across them. Steam no longer rose, but the smell was there, meat, potatoes, gravy, and on the driver's seat, a key ring. Dozens of keys. Not for that RV, not for those bikes. Old keys, bent keys, foreign keys, and one that made my stomach lurch, a brass one engraved with the number 27. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My pocket felt heavy, burning with the weight of the exact same key I'd woken up holding. I didn't look back. I climbed into my rig and floored it, gravel spitting behind me. The abandoned RV shrank in the mirrors, but the image didn't leave me. A family had been sitting there moments ago. I could feel it. I could smell their dinner. But something had unlocked them, pulled them through. At Coldfoot, I stumbled into the roadhouse like a drunk, my shirt damp with sweat, my eyes stinging from days without real sleep. The clerk behind the counter gave me a look that said I wasn't the first to walk in hollow-eyed and shaking. "You need gas?" he asked. "Information," I rasped. "People disappearing. RVs. Keys." His expression didn't change, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. "You keep driving north," he said slowly. "Or you turn back now. That's your choice, but if you stay too long in between, it finds you." "It already has," I whispered. For a moment, he just studied me. Then he reached under the counter and set something down, a map, hand-drawn, worn with creases and coffee stains. "Don't follow the road," he said. "Follow this, if you want to know what's happening." I stared at the map. It wasn't the Dalton. It wasn't any official highway. It was a line scrawled into the blank spaces running parallel to the road before veering west, deep into land marked as nothing but forest and tundra. I don't know why I took it. Maybe I wanted proof. Maybe I wanted an end. But the moment I folded it and shoved it in my pocket, the clerk muttered, "You've already opened the first door." I left Coldfoot shaking. The map burned against my leg, heavier than any paper should be. The sensible thing would have been to toss it, drive south, never look back. But my hands turned the wheel before my mind could stop them. I left the Dalton and followed the map's line into dirt tracks barely wide enough for my rig. Branches clawed at the siding. Mud sucked at the tires. The further I went, the fainter the track became, until it was no more than impressions in the grass. At dusk, I found it. A clearing, wide, perfect, as if carved out intentionally. And in the center stood rows of RVs, dozens of them, some old and rusted, their windows shattered, some new, their paint gleaming, all of them silent, empty, their doors ajar like mouths caught mid-breath. I stumbled out of my own rig, heart thundering. The air was thick with the smell of rust and smoke. As I walked between the rows, I saw what I had been dreading. Keys. Hanging from every doorframe, hundreds, maybe thousands, swaying in the still air. I reached out without meaning to, my fingers brushing one. The instant I touched it, the silence cracked. Voices poured through the clearing, hundreds layered atop one another, crying out, pleading, whispering names I didn't recognize, names of those who had been taken. I dropped the key and stumbled back, tears stinging my eyes, but the voices didn't stop. They rose louder until the trees themselves shook. And then, just as quickly, they hushed. In the silence that followed, I heard one voice. Clear. Direct. "Daniel." I spun, my chest heaving. At the far end of the clearing stood another me. Same clothes, same face, same hollow eyes. He held the skeleton key in his hand, raising it toward one of the locked RVs. The world tilted. My knees buckled. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, because I knew he wasn't my reflection. He was the one who opened the doors, and he was waiting for me to take the key. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the other version of myself. His grip on the skeleton key was loose, almost casual, like he wasn't offering it to me, but daring me to take it. His expression wasn't malicious. That would have been easier to fight. No, he looked patient, calm, as though he'd been waiting for me all along. My instinct was to run, but my legs didn't obey. The clearing seemed to hold me in place. Every RV door stood open just enough to show darkness inside, the hanging keys rattling in a wind I couldn't feel. It was a graveyard and a marketplace all at once, a place where disappearances weren't mysteries but transactions. The other me tilted his head, a mirror image slowed down by some invisible drag. He tapped the skeleton key against the side of the nearest RV. The sound rang out like a bell, vibrating through the clearing. Every door swung wider, voices spilled out, not screams, not moans, just fragments of ordinary life. Laughter, a woman saying grace, a child asking if they'd reached camp yet, a man humming while washing dishes, moments cut from lives that had ended here, playing on loop. The hair on my arms rose, my stomach twisted. It wasn't just that the voices were human, it was that I recognized some of them. Karen's voice, the woman I'd met near Denali, whispering about her brother. Walter's raspy tone telling me to keep my head on a swivel. They weren't gone. They were still here, locked behind doors that had no business being in this world. "Stop it!" I choked, my voice breaking. "Stop!" The other me didn't flinch. He only raised the skeleton key higher, pointing it at me like a conductor ready to cue the orchestra. The voices swelled. I clutched my head, the pressure unbearable. My own name echoed over and over, not from outside, but from within, as if my skull had become another door and they were testing the lock. Somewhere inside the cacophony, a thought crystallized. If I didn't make a choice, the choice would be made for me. That's what Elias had meant. The keys weren't just lures, they were demands. Each one was a door, and eventually you had to pick one. Refusing was the same as surrendering. I stumbled back to my rig, fumbling for the skillet, though I knew it was useless. A piece of cast iron against something that could mimic me, split me, mirror me. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. But when I swung open the RV door, the table wasn't empty. The keys were there again, perfectly arranged, gleaming in the dim light. Bounder, Ford, brass 27, the skeleton key in the center, and now a new one. A simple house key, the kind you could make at any hardware store. Silver, unremarkable, except etched into the head were 3 letters, DAN. My stomach dropped, my legs buckled, and I fell against the counter. It wasn't just collecting RVers anymore. It was collecting me. The other me stood at the edge of the clearing, still patient, still waiting. The doors behind him pulsed with sound, every voice rising like a tide. The wind carried the smell of rust, smoke, and something else now, something damp, sour, like earth freshly dug from a grave. I don't remember deciding to do it, but suddenly I was outside again, running across the clearing, the skillet clenched in my hand. I swung at him, at myself, screaming, the sound tearing my throat raw. The skillet connected. The weight jarred my arm. But instead of crumpling, instead of fighting back, the other me simply dissolved. Not into blood or bone, but into keys. Hundreds of them, spilling to the ground, clattering against each other until the sound became unbearable. I dropped the skillet, clamped my hands over my ears. The keys rattled, clanged, sang. Each one hummed with a different pitch, a chorus of locks being tested, broken, breached. Then silence. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. No RVs. No keys, just me, standing in waist-high grass beneath a sky the color of ash. My own rig was gone. I turned in circles, panic surging. The trees around me weren't the same. They were taller, darker, their trunks smooth as if carved by hand. And at the far edge of the clearing stood a single door, wooden, weathered. Freestanding, no frame, no walls around it, just a door, upright, waiting. The skeleton key was in my hand. I screamed, hurled it into the grass, but when I looked down again, it was back in my fist. Its teeth gleamed sharp and perfect. That was when I realized the truth. The disappearances weren't random. They weren't accidents. Every RVer who vanished had reached this same place, this same choice. The key was the price of admission, and once you arrived, there was no turning back. Behind me, the voices began again. Walter, Karen, the family I'd never met, all of them urging, begging, coaxing. Open it. My knees shook. My chest heaved. I staggered toward the door, every step heavier than the last. When I reached it, I pressed my hand against the wood. It was warm, pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. The skeleton key slid into the lock as if it had always belonged there. My hand trembled on the knob, and just before I turned it, I heard my own voice behind me. Calm, patient, familiar. You've already been here before. I froze, my hand still gripping the knob of that freestanding door. The words cut through me colder than the Alaskan wind ever could. You've already been here before. I turned slowly, terrified of what I'd see. And there I was again, standing just a few yards away, leaning casually against nothing, arms folded like a man watching his own reflection in a mirror. His face was mine, but older somehow. Tired, worn down in ways I hadn't yet lived. I wanted to shout at him, demand to know who or what he was. But my throat closed. the words shriveling on my tongue. "You never remember," he said softly, as if speaking to a child. "That's the cruelest part. Every time you come here, you think it's the first. You think you're different from the others. But you're not. You've already chosen." My breath came shallow. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, his boots not bending the grass beneath him. His eyes locked on mine, and I felt a pressure behind my skull, like his gaze could turn my memories inside out. "You think those stories you heard along the road were warnings," he said, "but they were echoes. You've told them before. Walter, Karen, the family by the Susitna, they weren't strangers. They were you." I shook my head violently, tears stinging my eyes. "No, I met them. I talked to them. Because you were them." His tone was sharp now, cutting. "Each time you vanish, you splinter. A piece of you becomes the next traveler, the next voice warning others. And still you drive north, over and over again, chasing the same door." The clearing tilted beneath me. My knees gave, and I staggered back against the pulsing wood. "That's not possible," he smiled sadly. "That's Alaska's backcountry. It doesn't erase you. It multiplies you. It collects you in pieces until all that's left are keys." At the mention of keys, the ground rattled. 1,000 of them spilled from the grass around me, clinking, jingling, rising into the air like a swarm of metal insects. They whirled around us, glinting in the dim light, each one humming with its own pitch. My double reached out, plucked one from the air, a plain brass key, and held it up. This was me once, before I turned the knob, before I realized I was already too late. The swarm tightened, circling me now, brushing against my skin, cold and sharp. I tried to swat them away, but they moved with intention, pressing against me, nudging me toward the door. "Don't fight it," the other me said. "You'll only make it worse." I wanted to believe he was lying, but deep down I knew he wasn't. Everything I'd seen, the abandoned rigs, the warm coffee, the voices behind the doors, it all pointed here. This was the source. This was the end of the road. The knob burned under my palm. The skeleton key glowed faintly in the lock as if urging me forward. I looked back at him, my voice breaking. "What's behind it?" His smile was thin, empty. "Everywhere you've already been, and everywhere you're about to go." The ground heaved, the sound of rattling keys swelling until it was a roar. I couldn't hold back anymore. My hand twisted the knob. The door swung inward, and there was no room, no hallway, no space at all. Only road. Endless road. A ribbon of gravel cutting across tundra, stretching into a horizon that bent back on itself. RVs dotted the shoulders, each one frozen in different states, some intact, some rusted, some half crumbled into the earth. And on the driver's seat of each, I saw myself. Different ages, different clothes, but always me. Always turning to look as the door opened. The swarm of keys surged past me, scattering into the landscape, embedding themselves into doors, ignitions, locks. And with each one, a version of me turned the key, started the engine, and drove forward. The sight hollowed me. It wasn't a collection, it was a recursion, a loop. Every disappearance wasn't an ending, it was a replication, a multiplying road of selves forever feeding the wilderness its hunger. The other me stepped beside me, his face unreadable. "You wanted answers," he said. "Here they are. The vanishings aren't mysteries, they're inevitabilities." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." He laughed softly, not cruelly, but with the weariness of someone who'd asked the same question 1,000 times. "There is no out, only through, only again." The road beckoned, the horizon pulsing like a heartbeat. My body felt pulled forward, dragged by a force deeper than gravity. My knees scraped the gravel, my palms bloodied, but I couldn't stop. I was being funneled like water into a drain. Behind me, the door slammed shut. When I looked up again, I was in my RV, parked on the side of the Denali Highway. The fire ring outside still smoldering, Walter's folding chair still across from mine. My heart seized. Had I imagined all of it? Then I looked at the table. The keys were there, every one of them. Bounder, Ford, Brass 27, Skeleton, and now dozens more. And on the window, written in condensation, was a message traced by a finger that wasn't mine. "You've been here before." The words on the window bled into me like frostbite. "You've been here before. My hand hovered inches from the glass, afraid to touch it, afraid it would smear into nothing and leave me wondering if I'd finally lost my mind. The air inside the RV felt wrong, too still, too heavy, like I was sealed inside a tomb. The keys on the table gleamed faintly, though no light should have been hitting them. My breath fogged, hanging in the air longer than it should. I whispered to myself, trying to anchor my voice in the silence. I'm Daniel Price. I'm 42. I was born in Montana. I'm alive. But the words didn't sound convincing. They trembled. They fractured. Outside, the forest leaned closer. I could hear it creak, branches groaning as though the trees themselves were inching forward, waiting. And beneath the groans, faint but clear, the sound of locks turning, one after another. A rhythm, steady, inevitable. I couldn't stay. If I stayed, the keys would multiply. The voices would grow. The door would open again. So I turned the ignition and forced the RV back onto the gravel road. The tires skidded, stones spitting behind me, the wheel shaking in my grip, but the road stretched on, as endless and indifferent as always. For miles, I drove without thought, past ridges, past rivers, past turnouts that looked too much like the ones where I'd already stopped. Every bend in the highway felt recycled, like I was driving through a looped film. At one point, I passed a familiar sight, the Winnebago. The same faded stripes, the same open door swaying in the wind. But this time, it wasn't empty. Someone stood inside. I caught the glimpse only for a second as I passed, but it was enough. A silhouette in the driver's seat, its head turning, slowly, deliberately, to follow me. I nearly drove into the ditch, my chest seized, my lungs locked, but I forced the rig back onto the road, eyes fixed forward, refusing to glance in the mirrors. By the time I reached another turnout, my hands were numb on the wheel. I pulled over, heart hammering, sweat soaking my shirt, and then I heard it again. The jingling. Faint at first, like loose change in a pocket, then louder, closer, until it filled the RV, rattling in the cupboards, shivering through the vents. The keys on the table began to vibrate, slowly at first, then violently, leaping and clattering until they spun in circles like compass needles gone mad. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Stop!" But the noise didn't stop. It crescendoed, a storm of metal, until suddenly, silence. One key remained on the table. All the others were gone. It was small, silver, etched with letters that made my stomach lurch. DAN, the same one I'd seen in the clearing. The one that had marked me not as a traveler, not as a victim, but as part of the collection itself. I stared at it for what felt like hours. My chest heaved, my throat dry. Every instinct screamed to throw it out the window, to bury it in the dirt, to leave it behind. But when I reached for it, the metal burned cold against my skin, and I realized, with a clarity that hollowed me, I couldn't get rid of it. No matter where I left it, it would return. That night, I dreamed again. The hallway, the endless doors, but this time they weren't closed. They were open. Behind each stood a version of me, some older, some younger, some nearly unrecognizable, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving in perfect unison. "Choose," they whispered. I woke gasping, my throat raw, my sheets damp with sweat. The silver key lay on my chest, exactly where my heart beat beneath it. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know if there was anyone else who had seen what I'd seen, if there was a way to fight it, to escape. So I drove south. I don't remember how long or where I stopped for fuel. The landscape blurred into one long gray smear, the sky a sheet of ash. But eventually, I reached a small town, one of those places with a single gas pump, a bar, and a scattering of trailers. I stumbled into the bar, hollow-eyed, my hands trembling. The place was nearly empty. A jukebox hummed quietly in the corner. Behind the counter, the bartender, a woman in her 60s with weathered skin, looked at me like she'd been expecting me. "You've got it, don't you?" she said simply. I froze. "Got what?" She set down the glass she'd been polishing and leaned across the counter. "The key. The one with your name." My throat tightened. I didn't answer, but I didn't need to. She could see it in my eyes. Her face softened, sadness etching into her lines. They all come through here eventually. Men, women, families. They think they're running. They think they're searching, but really, they're circling. Circling what? I asked, my voice hoarse. She tapped the counter with a fingernail. The same door, the same choice. Some open it fast, some drag it out, but in the end, the land always gets what it wants. I shook my head violently. No, there has to be a way out. Her eyes didn't waver. If there was, don't you think someone would have found it by now? The room tilted. My stomach lurched. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of a stool. Then what do I do? She studied me for a long moment, then whispered, "You pray you don't remember next time." The words lodged in me like a blade. I staggered out of the bar into the cold night, the silver key heavy in my pocket. The sky was clear, the stars sharp against the black, but when I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The stars weren't stars, they were lights. Hundreds of them, arranged in neat rows across the sky like RV windows glowing from within, and behind each one a shadow sat watching. I stood in that gravel lot, staring at the sky, my breath fogging in the cold air. The longer I looked, the clearer it became. Those weren't stars. They were windows. Each one flickering faintly, each one containing a figure. Some shadows slouched, some pressed their hands against the glass, some leaned forward as if eager to step through. And though they were distant, impossibly far, I knew them. I knew their faces. Walter, Karen's brother, the family from Talkeetna, dozens of others whose names I had overheard, whose stories I had carried, all of them staring down at me, waiting, trapped in those lit boxes in the sky. And in the center of it all, one shadow larger than the rest, me. I stumbled back against my rig, my knees weak. The silver key in my pocket pulsed, heavy as a stone, humming with a frequency that rattled my bones. I wanted to fling it into the dark, to throw it so far it would never return. But my hand wouldn't obey, because the truth had sunk in deeper than I wanted to admit. The key wasn't an object anymore. It was me. I crawled inside my RV and locked the door, though I knew locks meant nothing here. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the skillet as I clutched it to my chest, my last pathetic defense. The air inside was thick with the smell of rust, of damp earth, of smoke from fires I'd never lit. And then came the knocks. Not 3 this time. Hundreds, all at once. The entire shell of the RV quivered under the assault, like a storm battering every surface. Knuckles, fists, claws, keys. The sound surrounded me, pressed me into the floor, made the air itself vibrate. Daniel. One voice. Clear. Inside my head, outside my door, above the roof. It didn't matter. It was everywhere. You've already opened it. I screamed, a sound that tore from my chest raw and broken. No, I haven't. I never. The keys on the table lifted, spinning, clattering, rising into the air like a metallic tornado. My own silver key shot free of my pocket and joined them, glowing so bright it seared my eyes. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the RV. I was on the Dalton Highway. Gravel under my boots, wind tearing across tundra, horizon endless. My rig sat in the distance, door wide open, light spilling from within. But I wasn't alone. Dozens of RVers stood along the road, silent, unmoving, their eyes hollow, their bodies pale as frost. Each one clutched a key, and each one was me. They lined both sides of the road, stretching out of sight, a corridor of reflections, some older, some younger, some scarred, some smiling faintly, but all unmistakably me. Their voices rose as one, a tide of whispers that drowned the air. Choose. The silver key floated before me, hanging in the wind, turning slowly. The road behind me was dark, the road ahead glowing faintly with that impossible horizon. I knew what it meant. The choice wasn't whether to escape. Escape didn't exist. The choice was only how to continue. I reached out, my hand trembling, sweat slick on my palm. The key dropped into it, cold as ice. The whispers hushed. Every version of me leaned forward, watching. The door appeared again. Freestanding, weathered wood, the lock glinting, hungry. I staggered forward, chest heaving, tears streaking down my face. Why? I screamed. Why me? The chorus of my own voices answered, because you keep coming back. The key slid into the lock as if it had been waiting for centuries. My hand twisted, the door swung wide, light engulfed me, and when it faded, I was driving. Southbound. The Denali Highway stretching ahead, forest pressing close, sky bruised with twilight. My hands gripped the wheel. My eyes stared forward. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked back, calm, patient, like it already knew what was coming. On the passenger seat, a set of keys rested neatly. Bounder, Ford, skeleton, brass 27, silver DAN. The circle was complete, and somewhere in the silence, beneath the hum of the tires, I heard my own voice whisper, "You've been here before," and I knew with a hollow certainty that I would be here again. The first time I ever felt truly alone, I was parked under the skeletal branches of a pine forest that stretched like a frozen cathedral across the northern Idaho hills. The Volkswagen bus, an old 1974 Westphalia with chipped teal paint and the faint, lingering smell of burnt coffee from past trips, felt like both a home and a trap. I remember turning off the ignition and realizing that even the engine's last purr had vanished, swallowed by the thick, damp air. I had arrived at the campground at dusk, guided only by the fading GPS coordinates I'd found in a half-forgotten blog post about hidden Volkswagen-friendly sites, a place locals whispered about with a mixture of awe and fear. The sign at the entrance was rusted and nearly illegible. Whispering Pines Campground, reservations required. Only, there was no office, no staff, just a gravel road curling into the darkness like the tongue of some enormous patient creature. I remember laughing to myself, a nervous, hollow sound, telling myself that the fear I felt was just the woods playing tricks. I parked, set up the pop-top tent, and unloaded my small pack of essentials: flashlight, blankets, a thermos of tea, a worn journal. But even as I worked, I felt eyes on me. Not human eyes, exactly, but a presence. Something that existed between the trees, just outside the reach of the headlight beam. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind was moving branches just right, maybe an owl or fox, nothing more. I lit a small lantern, and its amber glow felt like a fragile shield against the dark that pressed against my van, against my ribs. The first night passed in uneasy stretches of sleep, punctuated by the odd creak of wood, the occasional rustle that seemed too deliberate, too close. By morning, a thin fog had settled over the campground, muting the contours of the forest and leaving only gray shapes drifting through the underbrush. I decided to explore. The campground itself was a grid of empty sites, each marked by decaying wooden posts and a small metal plate engraved with a number. I walked the gravel roads between the sites, noticing the faded carvings, names, dates, messages scratched into the posts, some going back decades. It wasn't uncommon in other campgrounds to see a heart with initials or a paw print, but here the etchings felt like warnings. Do not stay, they watch, reservation of the dead. I tried to laugh it off, but even then, my stomach knotted. There was a rhythm to the forest, a subtle, almost inaudible beat that made my teeth ache, like the land itself was breathing in sync with some unseen heart. I returned to my Volkswagen, deciding to wait out the fog before doing more exploring. That's when I noticed the first signs of abnormality. The gravel paths I had walked earlier now seemed different. I could swear the positions of the numbered posts had shifted, the angles subtly off, though I had only glanced at them the day before. A site that had been empty now held a toppled folding chair, as if someone or something had been sitting there, waiting. I told myself it was the fog, optical illusions caused by diffused light. But when I climbed into the driver's seat, the familiar sense of security the bus usually provided felt hollow. By the third night, the tension had begun to anchor itself deep in my chest. The forest noises, which should have been comforting in their familiarity, now sounded alien, staccato, and irregular. I lay in the pop-top bed, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening. There was a knocking at the side of the van, 3 sharp, deliberate raps. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The knocking repeated, softer now, moving around the perimeter of the van as though circling, testing. I reached for my flashlight, switching it on with trembling hands, and scanned the ground. Nothing but fog curling like smoke and the black, hollow shapes of trees that seemed impossibly close. Sleep, when it came, was fractured, full of dreams I didn't want to remember. Shadows slithered along the edges of consciousness, whispering in a language older than my own. I woke at some point to the sound of the van door sliding open softly. My heart pounded. I wanted to scream, but fear had locked my voice inside. No one was there when I flicked the lantern toward the opening, only the cold bite of night air drifting in. I checked the latches, convinced the wind must have done it, yet the mechanism was intact, no trace of tampering. And still I could feel that presence, just outside, patient, observing. Determined not to succumb to panic, I made a plan the next morning. I would explore further, gather evidence of my own sanity. I walked the perimeter, taking photos with my phone, marking each numbered post, recording notes in my journal. As I moved deeper into the campground, I noticed the signs that the place had once been full of life. Rusted fire pits, the charred remains of logs, remnants of tents long since claimed by decay, but also signs that the life here hadn't entirely left. Footprints, deep and oddly fresh, seemed to appear where none had existed before. I saw depressions in the ground that looked like someone had lain there, waiting. And always, always, the whispering, subtle, coaxing, just beneath the wind. The breaking point came when I saw the van that hadn't been there before. A second Volkswagen, nearly identical to mine, parked at the far end of the campground, doors closed, windows dark. I called out, expecting a fellow camper, but no answer. The air seemed to thicken, the fog curling higher, and my reflection in the bus's side mirror seemed to move independently, slightly delayed, as though reluctant to mirror my fear. I should have left then, turned the ignition and fled the forest road, but curiosity rooted me to the gravel. I circled the other van, flashlight shaking, and that's when I saw it. Etched into the rusted sliding door was my name, my full name, the one I had written in my journal the night before. Panic clawed up my throat, raw and visceral. I ran back to my bus, fumbling with the keys, heart hammering against ribs that felt ready to split. The forest seemed to respond, branches slapping against the roof and sides of the van as though trying to prevent escape. Every step felt heavier, as if the fog itself had weight. I locked the doors, started the engine, and the headlights cut through the mist. I wanted to scream, wanted to drive blindly out of the campground, but even then, hesitation held me. That other van remained just at the edge of the fog, windows opaque, inscrutable, watching. I did not sleep that night. I drove in circles within the campground, waiting for the first light, eyes darting to every tree, every shadow. And when dawn finally broke, pale and sickly, I discovered the truth, or at least the only version my mind could comprehend. The other van was gone. No tire tracks, no disturbances in the gravel, just empty sights, fog beginning to lift, the forest quiet again. I felt foolish, haunted by my imagination, or perhaps by something else entirely. The experience left marks on me deeper than any bruise, deeper than sleep deprivation or cold. In the following weeks, I returned to the site in daylight, trying to rationalize. The posts, the footprints, the shifting paths, they were all there, exactly as I had seen them. The etchings on the posts had multiplied. Reservation of the dead, they remember, never alone. And my name etched into a tree near the first site, black against pale bark, perfectly carved. I drove away that day, hands white on the steering wheel, the VW humming beneath me like a reluctant witness. I've told myself countless times that it was a hallucination, the product of isolation and fatigue. Yet I can still hear the knocking, the whispering, the soft, deliberate sliding of a van door in the fog. And every time I park a Volkswagen beneath a canopy of pine, the memory returns, visceral and accusing. Camping in a Volkswagen, I've learned, is not just about freedom or nostalgia. It's about intimacy with the land, yes, but also with whatever echoes dwell there when humans have long gone. Every creak of the frame, every sigh of the engine, every reflective glance in the mirror is a reminder that solitude is a fragile, fleeting thing. Some campgrounds are alive in ways we cannot measure. Some leave a reservation for the dead, and if you linger too long, they will find your name and whisper it back to you in the fog. Even after leaving Whispering Pines, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had followed me. My Westphalia hummed along the highway, teal paint dulled by dirt and sun, yet somehow I felt that same fog pressing against the windows. Every curve of the road seemed familiar, as though I'd already driven it in another life, and shadows at the edge of the tree line bent unnaturally, lingering just long enough to make me glance twice. I told myself it was fatigue, paranoia, the sort of anxious hallucination that comes after nights without proper sleep. But the unease didn't leave. It only grew heavier with time. I tried to immerse myself in other camping trips, seeking the comfort of other Volkswagen sites, other wooded sanctuaries, but the memory of that place lingered in the air I breathed. I began noticing patterns, small anomalies in each campground I visited, footsteps that didn't belong, tents seemingly rearranged when I returned, the faint smell of damp wood and charred pine, even in the middle of summer. And always, when I parked the van at night, there was that sense of being watched, just beyond the beam of the headlight, just outside the safety of the pop-top tent. It was on one of these trips far south in Oregon near Crater Lake that the memory of Whispering Pines resurfaced in full force. I had set up my Volkswagen on a quiet cliffside site overlooking the lake, thinking the isolation would be comforting. It wasn't. The wind carried an odd sound through the pines, a low, mournful moan like someone dragging heavy chains over wet stones. I brushed it off as echoes from the cliffs, but every instinct in my body screamed that it was something else, something waiting. That evening, I met another camper, a man in his 50s named Harold. He had a classic Type 2, much like mine, and we struck up a conversation about engine issues and interior refurbishments. I found a small measure of comfort in talking to someone else who understood the quirks of a Volkswagen bus, but as the night deepened, Harold's stories took a strange turn. He spoke of campgrounds that shifted overnight, vans that disappeared, and names etched into trees that weren't his own. At first, I laughed nervously, making light of coincidences, but his expression didn't waver. "These woods," he said quietly, "they have memory. They remember everyone who passes through. Sometimes they don't let you leave without paying attention." I felt a chill creep up my spine. Even in broad daylight, I could feel Whispering Pines breathing in my mind. I remembered the fog, the knocking, my name carved into bark, the van that wasn't there. Every rational thought wanted to push it aside, wanted to call it a trick of fatigue, imagination, or coincidence. But the memories pressed in, insistent and heavy, and I realized that the woods, no matter where I went, had left something inside me that I couldn't shake. That night, after Harold returned to his van, I stayed outside mine, lantern in hand, trying to document the stars, trying to convince myself I was alone. That's when I heard it again, a sliding noise, subtle and deliberate, coming from the forested slope above my campsite. I froze, heart hammering. It was the sound of a van door, the same sliding sound that had haunted Whispering Pines. I strained my ears, listening. The wind whispered, carrying what sounded like distant laughter, or was it crying, through the needles. My hands gripped the lantern tighter. I dared not move. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, slowly, I noticed it. A shadow among the pines, shaped like a Volkswagen, or perhaps two, indistinct in the dim moonlight. The outlines seemed to shimmer, bend, impossible geometry warping the edges of my perception. My breath caught. I reached for the keys, but every nerve in my body screamed that leaving might provoke it, might draw attention. The shadow didn't move closer, yet didn't retreat either. It lingered, patient, silent but insistent, like a waiting presence that knew my name without needing to hear it. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was another camper playing a trick, a reflection of the moon, or an illusion caused by fatigue, but deep inside I knew it was something else, something tied to the memory of Whispering Pines. That campground hadn't released me. It had marked me. And now, wherever I went, the echoes followed. My Westphalia, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a cage, carrying not just me, but the memory of that forest, the etched warnings, the reservation of the dead. The next day, I woke early and packed up without speaking to anyone. I didn't want to engage, to invite conversation, to risk confirming what I feared. As I drove, the lake shimmering behind me, I noticed the GPS flicker oddly, coordinates jumping slightly, directing me in loops rather than straight paths. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, yet the sensation was unmistakable. The road itself didn't want me to leave. I pressed on, rational mind battling the deep unease that each mile seemed to deepen. It was weeks later that the final piece of that lingering terror revealed itself. I returned to my journal from Whispering Pines and noticed something I hadn't before. Alongside my notes about fog, van doors, and knocking were entries I didn't remember writing. Words scratched in my handwriting, yet the tone unfamiliar, urgent, almost pleading. Do not stop. They are here. They follow. Never park. Never rest. My hands shook as I reread it. There were more entries like that, each one building in desperation, each one describing scenes I had no recollection of experiencing. I realized then that the forest had a way of inserting itself into memory, of bending time and perception. Whispering Pines wasn't just a place, it was an entity, a living, breathing presence that claimed the attention of those who entered, that remembered and recorded their names. And my name, once carved into bark, had followed me in thought, in fear, in memory, manifesting in ways I could not fully comprehend. From that point on, every camping trip became a test, a negotiation with memory and fear. I started leaving small offerings in my van, a candle, a scrap of paper, even a photograph from the day, to mark my travels and remind whatever lingered that I was aware, cautious, respecting its presence. The act didn't eliminate the fear, but it gave me a sense of agency, a fragile shield against the creeping dread that had begun to seep into all my journeys. And yet, even now, after years of trips, I cannot shake the feeling that I am still being watched. On quiet nights when the engine hums low and the pine needles rattle against the roof, I hear the faint sliding of doors, the whisper of movement outside the circle of lantern light, and I remember the lessons of Whispering Pines, the forest, the campgrounds, the old Volkswagen buses. They are repositories of memory, and some memories are not content to remain buried. I've learned to listen, to respect, to move cautiously and deliberately. Camping in a Volkswagen is an intimacy with nature unlike any other, a freedom tinged with risk, with the knowledge that the woods themselves can judge you, remember you, and sometimes reach out to reclaim what they believe belongs to them. Each trip, each forested site is a negotiation, a dialogue, a test of awareness. And if you fail to heed the subtle signs, the knocks, the shadows, the fog, you may find, as I did, that solitude is an illusion, and the ghosts of the campground are patient enough to follow you long after you think you've escaped. I remember the night I truly understood that some campgrounds never release you, that some places lodge themselves inside your memory like a splinter that cannot be removed. It was early autumn, and I had parked my Westphalia on the edge of a ridge in Northern California, a site overlooking a dry riverbed. The air was crisp, the stars sharp against a black velvet sky, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel normal, to feel free. But freedom, as I had learned, is fragile, and the forest always tests it. The first sign came as a smell, a faint acrid odor of burning pine needles mixed with something metallic, coppery, like dried blood. My van had been my safe haven countless times, yet that smell penetrated every seal, every seam. I tried to rationalize it, a campfire from a distant site, decayed vegetation and animal scavenging, but the instinctive knot in my stomach told me otherwise. There was a rhythm to the scent, a pulsing that matched the thrum of my heart, and the hairs on my arms stood rigid as I fumbled with the lantern. I sat in the driver's seat, trying to calm my racing thoughts, when I noticed the tracks. Not animal tracks, not tire tracks, something in between. They circled my van, faint depressions in the gravel that hadn't been there when I arrived. The pattern was deliberate, almost ritualistic, looping around the Westphalia like a predator marking its territory. My breath caught. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling, but the battery read 0%. No signal, no escape. I was completely alone, or so I thought. The first knock came then, soft but distinct. 3 taps, deliberate like fingers rapping on metal. My head snapped toward the side of the van. I wanted to call out to demand explanation, but the sound of my own voice felt wrong, alien, swallowed by the night. The knocking repeated, moving rhythmically along the van's perimeter. I pressed my back against the seat, listening to the silence between the knocks, trying to catch any other hint, any shadow. That's when I saw it. A figure between the trees, or rather, a movement that should not have been. It was the shape of a Volkswagen, impossible, ghostly, its contours shifting, bending with the fog. The outline pulsed, sometimes narrow, sometimes wide, as if breathing. I could feel its attention, sharp and focused, and the weight of it pressed on my chest, suffocating. I realized then that this was not a person, not an animal, but something older than the forest itself. I forced myself to breathe. I grabbed my journal, flipping to the first entry from Whispering Pines. Names etched into bark, the van that wasn't there, the fog, the sliding door, all of it came rushing back. I began to write, furiously, notes spilling onto the page in the hope of anchoring myself to reality. It's here, watching, waiting. Do not stop. Keep moving. My handwriting shook. The words felt alive, as if the journal itself demanded that I obey, that I recognize the truth. And then the whispering started. At first, it was faint, almost melodic, drifting through the cracks in the window seals. I leaned close to listen, heart hammering, and realized it wasn't random. The whispers called my name. Not softly, not kindly, urgent, insistent, accusing. Do not rest. We remember. You belong. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it only grew louder, penetrating bone, mind, and memory. I had to move. I started the van, tires crunching gravel, fog curling around headlights like smoke. The shape followed, keeping pace just beyond the reach of light, bending impossibly, vanishing, reappearing. My fingers clenched the wheel, knuckles white, breath fogging the windshield as I navigated curves and steep inclines. Every instinct screamed to drive faster, to escape. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in, the trees arching like hands, branches reaching to snag my van. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The forest never relented, fog thickening, whispers merging into a chorus, each voice overlapping the other. Exhaustion tugged at me, but stopping was not an option. Every campsite I passed, every clearing seemed to repeat the same pattern. Depressions in the ground, toppled chairs, etched warnings. They were markers, reminders of those who had lingered too long, who had not obeyed the unspoken rules of the campground. I was no longer just a visitor. I was a participant, a trespasser in a ritual older than myself. By dawn, I reached a plateau above a river that wound through the valley like a silver ribbon. The fog had thinned, the forest holding its breath. The shape that had pursued me all night hovered at the edge of the trees, almost solid now, a spectral twin of my own van. I could see the windows glinting with unnatural light, contours warped in ways that defied physics. And then I saw it. My name, etched into the side in deep black grooves. Not painted, not scratched lightly, but carved as though the forest itself had branded me. Fear boiled into a new clarity. I understood now that some campgrounds don't just house memories. They capture them, imprison them, and sometimes release them only to claim new travelers. The reservation of the dead wasn't metaphorical. It was literal. Names were taken, repeated, remembered, inscribed on objects, on trees, on the earth itself. I had been marked, not by malice, but by inevitability, by the memory of the land and the Volkswagen buses that carried us into its embrace. I sat in the van for a long time, engine idling, staring at the spectral twin. The whispering faded, replaced by silence so absolute it was almost oppressive. I realized I could never fully outrun this, could never escape the imprint Whispering Pines had left inside me. But I could acknowledge it, respect it, survive it. I made a promise to myself that night. I would continue to travel, continue to camp, but never alone in isolation for too long. I would document, record, and honor the spaces I entered. I would leave markers of my passage, subtle offerings that spoke not to ghosts, but to memory itself. And so I drove, van humming steadily, heart still rattling from the night's ordeal. The spectral twin disappeared as the fog lifted completely, leaving only trees and sunlight, ordinary and forgiving in their own way. But I knew it would return, as it always did, in whispers, shadows, echoes of my own name in strange campgrounds. Volkswagen camping had taught me freedom, yes, but also vulnerability, the knowledge that some places are alive in ways we cannot fully measure, and that solitude is always temporary. By the time I reached the next town, I felt both drained and enlightened. I knew now that the fear I had felt, the quiet unease, the creeping suspicion, the suffocating dread, was a guide, a warning, a lesson written into the very fabric of these forests. To camp in a Volkswagen is to embrace not just the land, but its memory, its moods, its ghosts. It is to recognize that sometimes the dead do not rest quietly, and that sometimes their reservation extends to the living, marking us, shaping us, reminding us that freedom is never free of consequence. The days that followed were heavy with an awareness I couldn't shake. Even in crowded campgrounds, with families laughing and dogs barking, the memory of whispering pines clung to me, shadowing every moment. The Volkswagen hummed beneath me like a reminder, every rattle and groan a subtle echo of the forests I'd traversed. I couldn't stop thinking about the etched names, the van that had mirrored mine, the whispering voices that had called me by name. They were part of me now, lodged inside my bones like a secret I couldn't confess. I returned to the idea of planning my next trip carefully, deliberately, trying to reclaim the freedom that the woods had stolen. I studied maps, read local histories, and sought campgrounds that promised solitude but also human presence, just enough to anchor me, to remind me that I was alive and not alone. I discovered a small site in western Montana, nestled on the edge of a river and thick with evergreens, that had been recommended by an older camper who swore it was friendly to Volkswagens. I laughed nervously at the phrasing, a subtle warning I didn't recognize until I arrived. The drive there was long, the engine humming steadily, the tires crunching gravel under fading daylight. I noticed immediately that the landscape had a rhythm to it, rivers curling like veins, trees arching over the road like watchful sentinels, hills rising and falling as if breathing. I reminded myself that this was normal, that forests were living things, not sentient traps, and yet the awareness that I had carried from whispering pines made every shadow seem deliberate, every rustle a potential warning. I set up camp as twilight fell, Westphalia resting against a gentle incline, windows fogged from the cool air. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, checking every latch, securing every seam, aware that the first night would test me, as it always did. The silence pressed in immediately, the kind of quiet that carries weight, that seems to watch and measure. I lit a small lantern, its warm glow spilling onto the gravel and illuminating the edges of the trees. I told myself I was prepared this time. I had learned. I had survived. And then the first knock came. 3 sharp raps, deliberate. I froze, listening. My hands gripped the lantern, fingers trembling, heart hammering. The knocking circled the van slowly, methodically, as if inspecting me, evaluating my presence. I held my breath, willing it to stop. The sound paused briefly, then repeated. My journal rested on the passenger seat. I opened it and began to write again, instinct taking over. We are here. We remember. Keep moving. Hours stretched into an unbroken night of watching, listening, waiting. The forest seemed to pulse, alive with the memory of every camper who had passed before me, marking their presence, their mistakes, their trespasses. I began to understand that survival here wasn't about fleeing. It was about acknowledgement, respect, awareness. The van, the pop-top bed, the very act of camping became a negotiation, a dialogue with a consciousness older than myself. By the time dawn broke, faint light cutting through mist and pine needles, I felt exhausted but wiser. The knocking had stopped, the whispers receded, and the forest seemed to exhale, releasing me temporarily from its scrutiny. I sat in the Westphalia, hands resting on the wheel, breathing deeply. I realized that the reservation of the dead, the forest, the ghostly campers, the echoes of whispering pines, was not malicious. It was a memory system, a record of those who had wandered too far, lingered too long, or ignored the subtle warnings. It demanded attention, and I had finally learned to give it. The drive home was quiet, reflective. The engine's steady hum and the familiar creak of the suspension provided a comforting rhythm, a tether to the present. I thought of all the Volkswagen trips I had taken since Whispering Pines, each site marked subtly by shadows, whispers, and small anomalies. I realized that every forest, every campground carries a memory, and that memory is alive, waiting for the careful, the observant, the respectful. Those who ignore it risk being claimed by it. Those who honor it survive and learn, carrying the lesson forward. By the time I returned to my home, Westphalia parked under the familiar shade of maple trees, I felt a quiet empowerment. Fear had been my teacher, whispering truths that rational thought could not fully grasp. The forests, the campgrounds, the Volkswagens, they had shown me the balance between freedom and respect, solitude and awareness. I had learned that camping in a Volkswagen is not merely about escape, adventure, or nostalgia. It is about intimacy with the land, with its memory, and with one's own instincts. I have continued to travel, always cautiously, always observant. I leave subtle offerings now, a small candle, a scrap of paper, a mark on a tree, to acknowledge the spaces I enter. I keep detailed notes, sometimes etching my own name discreetly, a ritual of acknowledgement and respect. And while the fear never fully dissipates, it is tempered by knowledge, understanding, and the realization that survival in these campgrounds is a dialogue, not a confrontation. Sometimes, when parked beneath a canopy of pine or beside a quiet river, I feel it again, the soft creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, the faint echo of footsteps. My hands tighten on the wheel, lantern light catches on shadows, and I am reminded of Whispering Pines, of the van that mirrored mine, of names carved into bark and gravel. But now I smile softly, because I know the rules, I know the rhythm, and I know how to honor the memory of the dead while continuing my journey. Camping in a Volkswagen has taught me more than I could have imagined. The quiet unease that grows into tension, the creeping suspicion that sharpens instinct, the dread that demands respect, and the reflection that transforms fear into wisdom. Each trip is a negotiation, a communion with the forest, and an embrace of both freedom and responsibility. Some campgrounds keep reservations for the dead, but they also teach the living how to survive, how to respect, and how to move through the world with eyes wide open and hearts attuned to the whispers beneath the pines. And so every time I pack my Westphalia and head toward the unknown, I carry the lessons of Whispering Pines with me. The forest is alive, its memory is long, its patience is infinite. But it also grants grace to those who observe, who respect, who honor the space and the stories left behind. The Volkswagen is more than a vehicle. It is a vessel of passage, a companion, a bridge between the living and the echoes of those who came before. I have survived, and I continue to travel, carrying both fear and knowledge, solitude and awareness. I have learned to listen, to see, and to honor. And when the fog rises, when shadows shift, when whispers call, I no longer tremble. I respond with respect, presence, and the quiet certainty that I belong to the living, while acknowledging the lingering presence of the dead. The forest does not forgive the careless, but it rewards the mindful. Volkswagen camping is not just adventure, it is communion, a reminder that even in the freedom of the open road, we are never truly alone, and that some campgrounds, some forests, hold memories far older and wiser than we can imagine. And if you listen closely, if you are attentive and respectful, you might just survive, you might just understand, and you might carry those lessons forward, etched into your memory as I have, like names carved into bark, silent, enduring, and never forgotten. It was months later when I returned to the northern forests, not to Whispering Pines, but to a site along the Snake River, a place less known, quieter, with fewer names etched into bark and gravel. I had brought the Westphalia as always, its teal paint dulled, its engine humming a familiar rhythm beneath me. This time, however, I felt different. The fear was still there, yes, that lingering, insistent whisper of memory, but it was tempered now by understanding, by respect, by experience. I had survived the forest's test before. I knew how to listen. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the river, painting everything in gold and deep blue. I parked the van at the edge of a clearing, rolled out the pop top, and began to set up camp. The sounds of the forest were different here, soft, ordinary, almost forgiving. Birds called, leaves rustled gently, and the river whispered over stones. I moved slowly, deliberately, aware of the rhythm of the land, the weight of history beneath the pine needles. There were no immediate signs, no knocks, no shifting shadows, but I remained vigilant, trusting both my instincts and the lessons I had learned. As night fell, I lit a lantern and sat beside the van, journal open on my knees. I wrote about the past year of trips, the encounters with shadows, the whispering woods, the spectral vans, and the carved names. Each line felt like a tether, anchoring me to reality, to presence, to understanding. And yet, in the quiet, I became aware of something subtle, a movement in the trees, so slight it could have been imagined, and yet it was deliberate. I felt a pulse in the air, a memory waking, assessing me. I did not panic. Instead, I whispered my own acknowledgement, softly, reverently. I see you. I respect you. I honor the past. The movement paused, then receded, as if satisfied with my recognition. I realized then that the forest, the campgrounds, the Volkswagen itself were not merely tests. They were mirrors. They reflected the fear we carry, the respect we earn, and the attention we must pay to the living and the dead alike. I had learned to listen, and in listening I had survived. The night passed quietly. No knocks, no whispers, no spectral van waiting just beyond the trees. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that feels like release, waking only when the first light of dawn painted the river in pale gold. I opened the van doors and stepped outside, feeling the chill of morning, the fresh pine, the soft hum of life continuing. And for the first time in years, I felt fully present, not haunted, not chased, not watched, but awake in a world that held both freedom and memory in equal measure. I drove away later that morning, Westphalia tires crunching over gravel, engine humming steady beneath me. The forest receded, yet I carried it with me, in memory, in awareness, in respect. Whispering pines, the shadow vans, the knocks and whispers, they were not gone. They were part of me, etched into my perception like the names carved in bark, reminders that freedom comes with vigilance, that solitude is a privilege, and that some campgrounds remember those who visit. Since that trip, I have continued to explore the United States in my Volkswagen. I visit campgrounds both hidden and known, seeking solitude and adventure, but always with respect, always observing the subtle signs, the rhythms of the land, the echoes of past visitors. I leave small offerings, a candle, a note, a gentle mark in the dirt, and I listen. I listen for knocks, for whispers, for the soft rustle of memory in the trees. The fear is still there, yes, but it is balanced now with understanding, with reverence, with empowerment. Camping in a Volkswagen is not simply about freedom, nostalgia, or escape. It is a dialogue with the land, the memory it carries, and the echoes of those who have passed before. Every trip is a negotiation, a communion, a subtle dance with the unknown. The forests, the campgrounds, the Westphalia itself, they teach patience, awareness, and respect. They remind us that solitude is temporary, that memory is enduring, and that the living and the dead coexist in ways we can only perceive if we pay attention. As I reflect now, years after Whispering Pines and countless trips, I understand that the lessons remain etched into my mind as deeply as any name carved into a tree. Quiet unease can become wisdom. Tension can sharpen instinct. Suspicion can teach awareness. Dread can cultivate respect. Panic, when tempered with presence, can become survival. Escape is possible, yes, but reflection and acknowledgement ensure that the lessons endure, transforming fear into knowledge and memory into guidance. And so, every time I park my Volkswagen beneath a canopy of pines, beside a river, or on a quiet ridge, I remember the reservation of the dead. I remember the knocking, the whispers, the spectral vans, and the fog. I acknowledge them, honor them, and continue my journey, empowered by both fear and understanding. I drive with eyes open, heart alert, and mind aware, carrying the forest with me, yet moving forward with courage, with respect, and with the enduring knowledge that some campgrounds never forget, and neither should we. Camping in a Volkswagen is more than adventure. It is a passage, a communion, a lesson carved into memory. And if you listen, truly listen, with care, presence, and humility, you may just survive, you may just understand, and you may carry those lessons forward like a name etched into bark, enduring, quiet, and never forgotten.